by Kenneth Smith. We're doing a series going through the text of what began as a column in the Comics Journal around the year 2000 and is being turned into a book. And the way that we're doing this is, well, slowly, because especially in the early chapters, because Kenneth Smith's approach is that he doesn't point towards himself and say, I have a coherent system you all need to learn. He points outward and says, there are a lot of people who have written on these subjects that you need to read if you want to understand the conversation that's taking place about these subjects. He's trying to drive us to develop multiple new perspectives, not one single orthodox perspective. And so this book is a perfect example of that. The whole theme of this book is looking at three different epochs of European history and how they saw the world very, very differently from each other. And if we can learn to understand those perspectives, it will help free us from being shackled by our own modern perspective. It says the tendency of modern readers when they read medieval or ancient writers or writers from Asia, Africa, or elsewhere is to assume that they more or less are like us, they see the world more or less like us, and that they must be using the words more or less like the way we do for the kinds of purposes that we have. And he says that's just a profound misunderstanding of these writers right out of the gate that ensures that we're not going to grok what they're talking about. So by doing this exercise of learning to see the world in at least three radically different ways, we prepare ourselves for thereafter, for the rest of our lives, being able to exercise that more and take on new perspectives. We are in the introduction. This is chapter 2. It is called Time, History, and Nature. It is a quick overview of the entire rest of the book. We have previously talked about the section on the ancients and the section on the medievals. And for the last couple of weeks, we're now at the opening of the section on the moderns. And part of what we're trying to grasp is Pico della Mirandola, who has been called sort of the godfather of the Renaissance. He was tied up with the Renaissance movements in art, in science, in culture, in religion. He was friends with Savonarola, who inspired Martin Luther. He had attended Paris University and was part of the burgeoning university system that Christian Europe set up after exposure to the Islamic world during the Crusades. And as such, he was in the middle of this amazing ferment. Right? He was one of those guys who knew everybody and talked to everybody. And that is both why he was in a position to make some extraordinary insights into the possibilities of the future, and also to not understand what it was that he was doing because he was surrounded by distractions and trying to put the whole picture together, which would have been beyond anybody. So last week we focused on Pico a bit. I figured this week we could focus on some of his influences. Who are these other people he was talking to? And what were how did they help usher in the modern era? And that'll help us to better understand his role and why it was that the things he wrote had the impact that they did. Phil's got his hand up and we'll start there. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, before you move to these other people, I want to go over what Pico did.
Please.
I realized that he was trying to tweak the system. He wasn't trying to, cast us into modernity.
Right.
But it seems to me that he was, even though it was very ingenious what he said, he was not perceptive enough to understand the psychological conditions.
Right.
Not that they have psychology, but let's say the psychic conditions of humanity. If we take, I don't know whether this applies, but if we take the Catholic understanding of the relationship between truth, beauty, and goodness, it just seems to me he would have seen that at least the church and probably humanity was not seeking those things, because it seems to me like once you release free will, then you have to choose between truth, honesty, and deceit. Seems to me the church and people were very deceitful, despite the fact of what he wished they would be. And in terms of, let's say, beauty, it seems to be the contrast, the dialectic between, let's say, harmony and discord.
Yes.
It seems to me there was discord, and maybe he was trying to fix that, but nonetheless, that has something to do with people, I guess, going back to being deceitful. It created discord. And then in terms of, let's say, goodness, benevolence, and malfeasance, or generosity and selfishness, it seems to me that these things were very obvious that he was trying to tweak. And it seems to me they were weighted in the wrong side. And if you liberate people totally, yeah. Seems to me they would slide even more in those sides. How come he did not recognize that, oh, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't liberate people anymore than they are already. We should constrain them more rather than liberating them to their virtuosity, because they'll virtually do, the deceit, the selfishness, and the discord. And so I wonder, yes, he was brilliant enough to see that, but I wonder whether he was, had the patience to see the details of what it would result if he manifested this sort of virtual world, that it would inflate to this deceitful and deceptive world that it would eventually become. So I just want to ask that question. It seems to me there was a flaw there.
Yeah, certainly. I think it was last week someone pointed out he was in his 20s. So he didn't have an enormous amount of life experience with which to gauge what he was doing. And I think part of the way that we can see that is that he really had no idea the storm he was bringing down on himself. He really thought, although he thought he was doing something exciting and radical and being an innovator, he also was trying to do it within the existing system and thought that the system would welcome his contribution. He was very surprised when the papal investigation decided that some of his theses were heretical, and eventually decided the whole thing was heretical and that he was a problem. One wonders whether he went to his grave being assassinated going, what did I do? It's like he didn't fully see the implications of what he was doing, but the reasons for that aren't just that he was young, but that there's a relationship between what was known and what was not known in the medieval worldview that was part of his view of the world as well. And he couldn't see the consequences of his choices as well as the church hierarchy could, and as well as, say, the Medicis could. So other people with a lot more sober, calculating perspectives on power were evaluating him in ways he wasn't able to evaluate himself. He sort of blundered into the mess that he blundered into. Sharon, you had your hand up for a bit. Did you want to talk?
Well, I just wanted to ask, wasn't he operating in the same medium in which we are today? There's the reality, and then there's the myth of that reality. And I think Pico probably saw the myth and tried to address it, but the reality was completely different. So that's my question. So when Phil says probably he wasn't able to see where he was going, it's because where he was going was just shrouded in all this operative deceit from the church and the government and the culture.
Yes. And also there's a difference in the worldview. We've talked about, the ancient hierarchy of nature over the gods, over man, and the modern revision through two revolutions is now man over nature, over the gods. But in the medieval period, they'd overthrown nature, but God was still at the top. And since he was an omniscient, omnipresent, all good God, they had to believe that absolutely everything was part of some single enormous plan. For 1,000 years, philosophers and mathematicians and theologians and scientists, everybody was operating under the idea that everything fit together into this very tidy structure. And since they didn't know for sure what the tidy structure was, They thought that their job was to figure it out and understand God better by doing that, but they were sure it was there a priori. And because the Orthodox medieval church had such a focus on stamping out heresy, this went side by side with the idea that a number of the conclusions were foreordained and you couldn't question them. So what they were really trying to do from their perspective was fill in the missing puzzle pieces. They felt like the whole puzzle had been defined by the orthodoxy, but there were pieces that hadn't been explained. And as they encountered new discoveries in science or exposure to other cultures, they would come to understand, okay, there's pieces missing, but they were sure those pieces must fit in this puzzle. The idea that this puzzle couldn't contain all these pieces, that there were things incompatible with the puzzle, was unthinkable, in that way that things can only be unthinkable when you know you're going to be punished if you don't think it. When you know that, people are going to be burned at the stake for not thinking it, you get really good at thinking it, whether it makes sense or not. And so what you get during this pre-Renaissance university movement is people bringing in new information that absolutely doesn't fit in this puzzle, because this puzzle was never designed to contain these pieces. But they're going to make it fit. They're going to use everything that they've learned from theology and mathematics and logic to hammer these things into place and try to create a mosaic that accounts for everything in order to remove the fear that there might be any loose ends, right? You're trying to remove opportunities for heresy. This is how Pico thinks he's helping the church. He says, I'm not trying to be a problem. I'm trying to solve a problem. He doesn't want to come out and say, you've got the problem. You can't say that, but everybody can see that there's some problems with the cosmology and the theology. So he's trying to repair that by inventing this myth. So to go to what Phil said, he doesn't think he's liberating freedom, the human will. He doesn't think he's opening the Pandora's box and unleashing free will upon the world. And indeed, that reading was very popular early in the 20th century, but increasingly it's coming under attack as we realize that he didn't mean to do that. He was just trying to account for human free will. How is it that God can be all powerful and all knowing and all good, and yet it's still up to us whether we go to heaven or hell? They're trying to reconcile the core irreconcilable piece of the medieval theology, and everything's at stake with it. So he feels like he has to resolve it. And the problem is the church would rather people just not talk about that part back then in the medieval structure and the Orthodox structure. And the reason they would rather that is that in the early struggles before the medieval revolution, many solutions had been offered and none of them were good. It was an intractable problem and it became the third rail of the theology. So anytime you approached that particular problem, you were supposed to resort to the standard catechisms and recitations of how it is that you avoid dealing with it and move on. And if you just stayed focused on it and tried to fix, even if your goal was to fix it and to help, then by definition, you're a heretic and you're a threat to the whole structure. And Pico just went right there, put his hands right on the rail and said, this is the problem I'm going to fix for everybody. He was not intending to be a great liberator. He was just intending to make sense of the whole puzzle to help everybody rest secure within the framework of an improved medieval, worldview. That's what he thought he was doing.
Let me address what Sharon asked.
Please.
It occurred to me that what he did was, by creating this sort of virtuality, is that it created a mediation between the ideal and the manifest reality. It's kind of like between God and man, so to speak.
Right.
And in some sense, this third allow virtuosity to not exist at merely a mythic level, which is very vague. It's there, it's a promise, it's there. And the manifest world, which is sort of there, absolutely, but is not going anywhere very fast. And the virtuality, which is a promise that it will happen soon, right? It's like, and it's up to humanity to manifest that promise, the possibility to bring it forward. Right. And I think that possibility gave that third world in a sense, a kind of responsibility for free will to manifest itself. And what that does is leads to a kind of inflation. I hate to use that word, but in some ways I mean it. Inflation of the fundamental reality of nature by producing this extra, this sort of surplus of possibilities that man must manifest, which is not a myth. It's somewhere in between. That is almost it's almost like you could almost touch it. And I think that inflation is what actually creates the world we have, but also the diversion from what the actuality truly is, and we're suspended in that world. And so I think that's important to know that the third was an important aspect because I think even in even in classical thing, there was really the two, and there was the gods. I guess the gods mediated. There was another force and the god mediated. I guess man took over this sort of Superman, the Greek god notion. So I think that's where the problem is, that divergence creates this separation. And now we know in the market, once again, inflation is that people truly believe in that reality, right? It will come, right? We got our hands on it. Well, look at the Eiffel Tower. look what, I mean, all these things that shows itself, so I think it's more than myth. It's an inevitability. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. It's part of what takes some getting used to in understanding how different these three epochs' worldviews are from each other is kind of, it's possible to use any one of these worldviews to understand the others in the sense of rewriting them to make sense to us, even when we don't know that we're doing it, just unconsciously recasting and reframing them so that they're making decisions the way we would make decisions. The part that's really hard is putting your finger on, for each of us, it's going to be a different combination, but what is the combination of modernisms in our thinking that rule us to the point that we can't imagine somebody who doesn't think that way? It's not that we've considered the idea that they didn't and rejected it. It's that we didn't even know that was a thing we were doing, let alone a thing that somebody could not do. So a key example of this, and this is where you can sort of see how the medieval quest for meaning is a two-edged sword, is that to a modern, nothing means anything. We're free to decide what things mean to us precisely because they have no meaning in and of themselves. If they had a meaning in and of themselves, we would all have to believe the same thing in order to, be right. But in the modern world, we're allowed to choose whatever we want. This is how they got out of the religious wars of the medieval epoch. In the modern epoch, they said, choose your own religion. We're not going to say anymore. We're going to make governments without agreeing on religion. We're going to make economies without agreeing on religion. We can all think different things and yet still govern ourselves through these mechanisms that we're going to create that will allow us to resolve disputes. This is the premise of modernism. And what's underneath it, which we take for granted, is that nothing really matters, which means we can have any opinion we want to. Now, we may think in different areas of the modern world, you should exert yourself. Like, for example, scientific endeavors, we should pursue them in a scientific way. Legal matters, we should pursue in a legal matter, and so forth. There are these norms that you're supposed to follow. But we also, the fact that there could be completely different norms in different parts of life suggests the idea there are no universal norms that unite all of life. You see what I mean? There's a lot of things in modernism that feel free and enlightened, but when you dig deeper, the foundation that they're resting on is a great yawning abyss of the idea that since nothing means anything, we can feel free to artificially construct any meaning we want to. whether we do it for pragmatic reasons, whether we do it for, traditional reasons, theological reasons, aesthetic reasons, still this idea that the ego is liberated to impose its own order on the world is like at the centerpiece as an unexamined part of modernism. Medievals didn't think that way. That was inconceivable in the medieval world. It's just the idea that nothing mattered. The fact that things mattered, which they knew to be a fact, was the basis for everything. That's how they decided the structure of their religion. That's how they decided the structure of their governments, the way their economy worked. Every last thing of the medieval world was based on a foundation of meaning. And whenever you had a disagreement, the way you resolved it was not by saying, well, let's have a vote. And it was not by saying, well, let's each do our own thing. It was by saying, what is this meaning that everything is founded on? And are you or are you not in alignment with that meaning? If you're not in alignment with that meaning, then you're wrong. And that's how even a king could abase himself and dress, and you put himself in sackcloth and ashes and kneel and beg the Pope, to give him the blessing again of God. Because even if he had the power, even if he had the armies, even if he had the wealth, if he didn't have the meaning, then under the medieval worldview, even he didn't think he could be king, which to us is inconceivable, that the ego could do that, that was even possible. Modernist readings of that encounter always attempt to reduce it down to something that would make sense to a modern mind. Why would we do what he did? But we would never do what he did for the reasons that he did it. He's a medieval. So the great problem, and I'll call on you in a second, Douglas, the great problem then that people like Pico and all the other theoreticians and theologians and philosophers and scientists of the medieval period face is that they think the structure of meaning is set and that they can't question any of that. And it's not that they can't question it because they're explicitly afraid of being burned at the stake. That's how a modern misreads the medievals. It's because they can't question it, that they know it all makes sense. They know it's all been designed according to a God who has a single overarching plan in the medieval Orthodox sense of the word instead of the modern Christian sense of the word. And so they can't question most of the components of their worldview. Right? They're not as smart as God. They can't be. And God's designed it all. So inherently that focuses them on working details and never becoming radicals, never going to the root of where these problems are come from. If there's a contradiction in the theology, they cannot question it if it goes to the root. They can only question it if it seems to be details that they can move around. But everything at the root is God, and you can't question God. God's smarter than you are and sees more and is more powerful. So he's made it the right way. So you see the trap that they're in. They're having a renaissance of exploration of old ideas and ideas from other countries, of old aesthetics and aesthetics from other countries, scientific discoveries, insights. All this new information is pouring in that this worldview was never designed to hold and reconcile, and it doesn't fit. But they also lack the ability to question the foundation of meaning where these contradictions exist. If it hadn't been the Orthodox sect that won, if it had somehow been, the house religion version of Christianity, the brotherhood and sisterhood of man version, that wasn't based on rigid orthodoxies, rigid structures in this way, then this particular crisis of the medieval world couldn't have happened the way that it did. It was the rigidity, the successful imposition of orthodoxy that created all of the problems that caused it to shatter in a brittle way at the end of its epoch. And that's why modern Christianity, most forms are different from the medieval forms. They had to break out of that shell. That shell was too constricting. Douglas, go ahead. Oh, you're still on mute.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, there's a couple of good things here. First of all, they could be burnt at the stake. Okay, and like some of the scientists were burnt at the stake. Who was on one and everything else on that. Okay. So that was right. So they weren't going to take the chance, okay, at that time. Now that's one thing. There's another thing you mentioned, is, and it depends on where you go here, okay, in the world,
Yeah.
okay. And like here in the United States, we got freedom and everything, but go to some of the places like Russia or China or some of these other places, and you may be in for surprise. They're not, they're going to, be in a pretty kind of negative way. So there's, it depends on where you're going in the world, type of thing. Some are still kind of medieval in a lot of ways. Go to some of the places in the Middle East and so on, and you would see some of these things.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, but the thing about modern forms of totalitarianism is that they're done for different reasons and in different ways than medieval totalitarianism was ever attempted. Like, one of the things that we've talked about is that the medievals lacked the industrial capacity to impose their totalitarian desires, for the orthodoxy to impose its totalitarian desires, not only upon the rest of the world, but even upon its own population, which is why the medieval epoch is not only the epoch of orthodox totalitarian goals, but also of a flowering of heresies everywhere. They just simply couldn't stamp it out. They didn't have enough science and industry in order to successfully stamp it out. There would be these lurches where the medieval world would rush out and try to, get rid of the Albigensians or get rid of the Hussites or go retake Jerusalem. But in between those moments, like, there was heresy everywhere. Like, literally every country had heresy. All the countryside, all the forests, all the villages. There's a reason they were terrified of witches. The Church Orthodoxy knew that they were failing to do the thing that they most wanted to do, which is to unite Christianity around a single vision. One of the big differences in the modern epoch is that industrialization and science have given us the capacity to mass manufacture minds and to produce force greater than any medieval culture ever could. And so when a totalitarian regime gets set up, it has the potential to do something the medieval world could never do. So this is part of understanding the difference between modernism and medievalism, is that imposing orthodox points of view upon an entire country successfully, so that nobody is out there, seriously challenging you, is only that's not a medieval thing. The medievals were never capable of that. It's strictly a modern thing. And that's why you get your holocausts and your gulags and your so forth. The other thing is that it's possible to wield freedom in order to impose orthodoxy. The modern world has this paradoxical conception of freedom. So, for example, if we have mass education, we can make sure that by the time everybody reaches age 18, they may disagree about all kinds of things. So they're spectacularly divergent if you just look at them. And yet, if you scratch the surface of how do they conceive of the world, they all conceive of the world more or less the same way. Even the rebels are rebelling in a modern way. It would never occur to a modern to rebel in a medieval way or an ancient way, because we can't see the world that way anymore. It's out of reach for us. So we're not actually free. What we are is a part of a different epoch in which freedom is waved a lot as a flag. But, if you expose the wrong war crimes, or if you tell the truth about, certain diplomatic cables, you could find yourself, under arrest, and persecuted to an amazing extent, because we have freedom, but not if you question certain things. And that's what Pico ran afoul of in a very different sense in the medieval world. He thought he was free because he didn't think he was challenging the medieval world. He thought he was just exploring the aesthetic and intellectual and religious implications of the things that he'd learned, and he had no idea that was going to get him into trouble. But the heat came down on him, just like it comes down on Edward Snowden or any of these other guys who color outside the lines of the modern era. Each epoch protects itself. What makes it a coherent epoch instead of one of the transitional periods is that it has put together both ideological structures that almost everybody share, and then also power structures that are imposed to catch the strays that work really well. If they didn't work really well, it wouldn't be an epoch, it'd be a transitional period. But once people inadvertently converge upon the right recipe so that things pull back inward and you get the proper centripetal force to pull inward, then you have a going concern and you have an epoch. There's not real freedom in any of these three epochs. What there is freedom defined in a different way and used for different purposes within different constraints, in ways that are typical, almost like a signature once you see them of each epoch. What can you do? What can't you do? And why would you or wouldn't you want to do those things? Almost defines the era. Donald, then Sharon, then Phil, I think.
Just to reinforce what you said in talking with Douglas is, Kenneth, not in this work, but other places, points to Arendt, that Hannah Arendt, that totalitarianism is a distinctive modern invention.
Yeah.
We might talk to the medievals about a theocracy. They just couldn't control in detail other parts of life. And
yeah,
this last week, I was YouTubing, and to paraphrase Norm Macdonald, that's a really good question. And you know who has the answer to it? Vince Foster. No. He was the guy that shot himself.
Right.
Anyway, but he was just answering questions that way. You'd say, that's a really good question. You know who knows the answer? Oh, well.
Gotcha.
Go ahead.
Thanks,
Go
Donald.
ahead. But
Sharon and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
So I'd like to come back to the text.
Please.
Because we're talking about Pico and his pluses and minuses.
Yes.
There's one sentence here that I'd like you to elaborate on. Pico had to invent his own myth ad hoc to make it plausible, invoking a convenient fiction, hypothesizing or stipulating a metaphysical or theological premise that tells one what one wants to hear.
Yes.
And so in preparing for this week, I read up on all the people that influenced him.
Nice.
So I want to know, what was the final result of that? What was the myth? Because
right.
He was exposed to the rabbi, he was exposed to the imams, he endorsed Christianity. And so the material that I was reading said that he evolved and he was pretty eclectic.
He was.
That's the word they used for him.
Yes.
So my question is, what was the myth that he put forth? And this is why I was trying to tell Phil, what was the myth that he put forth to explain what he saw and how it should go forward?
This is what we talked about last week, this idea that he saw the problem, the same problem that later atheist writers would center on, which is, how could an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God create human beings who he then condemns to hell? How does this work? And the orthodox solution is, he doesn't condemn us to hell. We have the capacity to choose God, but because of our free will, we're not forced to choose God. And so we can choose hell. And that's just the way it is. But that only works if you don't scratch the surface very much. If you scratch the surface, you start asking, well, why did God make us that way? Why was, and what is it about us that makes us choose hell? Why would we choose eternal? And are we even choosing eternal damnation? Or is it do we not know? And if we don't know, why weren't we given the knowledge we needed to make the correct decision? There's if you dig even a little bit deeper, the apocalyptic structure that the Orthodox medievals put in place, it's full of problems. And the longer the medieval epoch went on, the harder it became to ignore that, because the more theologians had written learned, well-received, and widely circulated and read works that really made it impossible to ignore. They did their best to defend it, but in defending it, they also made the problem clearer. And in the age of the printing press, it became really clear. Now everybody's reading these things and going, well, hold on a minute. Things they just never thought about before are suddenly right in front of their eyes and they can't look away. So Pico's trying to solve that problem. He's trying to help, which the church would rather he not do. And he's trying to solve that problem. And his solution, which we elucidated last week, is as follows. It's that all of the other creatures God created with instincts such that they know what the proper life is for them, and they long to do that thing, and they do. You don't find lions and tigers and bears, oh my, in hell, says Pico, or nor birds, right? The birds and the bees, everybody knows their job that God wants them to do, and they do it, and as a result, they make this perfect universe that God has created. It's clear that most people don't know what their purpose is or what they're supposed to do. And certainly, even if they figure it out, a lot of them don't, because otherwise nobody would be in hell. So Pico has to explain where do people fit within this cosmos in which everything else seems to know what God wants it to do and does it without a problem. Why do we have a problem? And the Orthodox position doesn't answer this question. It just says, don't ask. Stop asking. So he proposed an answer.
And was that just a conceptual approach to everything rather than rigid orthodoxy? Is that what his proposal was?
Well, he was trying to patch the rigid orthodoxy with a story.
Yes.
And his story was that God's lonely. If God makes a universe full of things that all know exactly what they want to do, then they have impoverished wills. Whereas he, as the first actor, as the Logos, has this infinite will. And how could somebody with an infinite will feel at home in a cosmos with nobody else like himself? And so he says, that's where we come in. We're the solution to God's problem. Now God has someone to talk to who experiences the same difficulties with having a will, with having freedom, and who therefore can participate in this divine conversation with God and make him feel at home in the universe that he's created. It's, nice. He's going for a nice, pleasant, emotionally satisfying solution. The problem is, in order to generate that solution, he's attributing to God things that the Orthodox Church would rather he not attribute to God.
Yes.
Such as loneliness. Why would God be lonely? You're saying God can't make a universe that pleases himself? I mean, ultimately, right, Pico's saying God screwed up, that God made a perfect universe, and as a result, he couldn't like it. It's like the only way he could shoehorn people with free will into this universe was to create this story in which he's actually damaged the perfection of God, and the Orthodoxy cannot stand for that. They're like, you can't go there. Furthermore, they say, and I think this is probably the most important point, it's our job to tell you how the universe works according to God. It's not your job to tell us. And by doing that, you are doing the most damaging thing of all, which is rocking the stability of the medieval flow of order. Right? You are effectively questioning our, authority, our divinely appointed authority, which means you're questioning God, which makes you a heretic. So there was no way out for Pico. So the question is, why would Pico make this story in the first place? And there's two answers to that. And one is, since he grew up in the medieval university system, he was exposed to all these ideas, and because he grew up as a medieval, he needed to find a place for everything and put everything in his place. Medievals were better at that than moderns are. Moderns have a shockingly high tolerance for things that don't make sense. We just say, not my circus, not my monkeys, right? That is a piece of modern wisdom, which is, I'm not going to try to make sense out of everything. I'm going to pick my areas and I'm just going to make sense out of them. And the rest of it, it can be incoherent, and that's fine. I don't have time to deal with all that. But to a medieval, especially to a medieval intellectual who had been highly educated, that was not an unacceptable solution. That was not a conceivable solution. A place had to be found for everything. So he couldn't look at this problem and then say, well, I just won't solve that. He had to solve it. His very medievalism and education drove him to go right to the core of it and come up with. And of course, the problem is the only real solution is to go to the foundations of the theology and find the contradiction at the base and say, wow, I think that the Orthodox Church back in the year 400 or whenever locked into place some rigid orthodoxy that doesn't actually work. And maybe we should have a more liberating approach to Christianity that goes closer to the kinds of things Jesus used to say, because the things Jesus used to say didn't have these orthodoxies rigidly locked into them in this way. He was full of questioning things. He was constantly questioning things. That was like Jesus's whole way. was the parables and the stories.
Mhm.
So Pico says, and furthermore, I've been educated in classical authors who we're just now rediscovering, and like Plato did the same thing. Plato was constantly telling stories in order to explain things. So to him, it was a natural thing to say, well, I will solve this problem with a story. And it's a nice story. And if you accept the story, it all falls back into place. But the Orthodox Church did not appreciate his help. We'll explore some more about Pico and as we dig into some of his influences, because that's where we'll also see that the problem is when you try to pull together all these irreconcilable things, you lose track of all the things that can't be reconciled in what you're trying to do, and therefore your actions create contradictions, the petard upon which you are hoist, and that's ultimately what did it. If the theory is true that it wasn't the church that had him and his lover assassinated, if the theory is true that it was actually the Medicis that assassinated him, then it will be as a result of his relationship with Savonarola, which we'll talk about in a moment.
Yeah.
Phil, go ahead.
Yeah. If Pico was so well educated and read so many things, it almost seems as if he didn't read Saint Anselm's ontological proof of God. because it, when he gave man the freedom so he could converse with God, and God was perfect, then God knew that it was going to fall into folly. So therefore it was entrapment. The whole thing was entrapment. It was not that you have a choice. I know that you would choose the bad way. So you did have a choice. That is entrapment. That is not free choice, right? So it's if he had read, I don't know whether he read it. So it seems to me he would realize that God is not only perfect. He didn't need somebody to converse with. He knows everything. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, how come he left that particular one out? I mean, it just seems like such a fundamental ontological argument. I mean, like, I don't buy it, but nonetheless, when you look at a thing, it's like, well, okay, yeah. God is that way. God is perfect. So that's interesting. So, I was going to say something else, but I'll save that to a later moment. So
yeah, I shared some links. Saint Anselm is an excellent reference here, and his proslogia on ontological argument for God. The problem we get into with being highly educated is that you fill your head with a lot of things that don't fit together very well. Mm-hmm. This is the truth about education that the medieval worldview couldn't accept. Because for the medieval worldview, everything true had to fit together, and only false things could be excluded. They had, since the time of Aquinas, they had bought fully into his binary logic and the law of the excluded middle, and the law that contradiction proves that something is false. And so they made themselves epistemologically unfit to deal with paradox. They equated contradiction and paradox. And they said, anytime you see things that don't seem to fit, you can just suppress one of the things as not being true, especially if one of them is orthodox and the other one is not. When you combine the rigidity of binary logic and the law of the excluded middle with an enforced orthodoxy that has been in place for 1,000 years, since long before you had half the science that you currently have, what you have is a recipe for disaster. Because there are things you cannot question, but you are also required to follow the rules of logic. And all by itself, that's incompatible when you get a premise that doesn't fit. So you see this in St. Anselm. He talks about what is the relationship between reason and faith. And he says, the solution is faith-seeking understanding. That is, faith comes first, but you cannot exclude reason. Reason must serve faith, says St. Anselm. He says, in the first place, you can't exclude reason because, as he says, to me, it seems to be negligence if after confirmation in the faith, we do not study to understand that which we believe. He says, to have faith blindly is a crime. If you have the opportunity to understand your faith, you must take that opportunity. Otherwise, you're turning your back on God. God has a plan. The things you're supposed to have faith in make sense. And if you don't attend to that plan with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul, what kind of Christian are you? However, says St. Anselm, that doesn't mean that something being rationally proven demonstrates that it's true. It must also conform with Scripture, right? Yeah. Because the Scripture tells us God's plan. So herein he solves the problem. He puts them together where one is the servant of the other.
So could I ask, I mean, it almost seems like reason is the character witness to God. I mean, not God's edict. I mean, as if God needs a character witness. So
that's kind of what Anselm's saying. That's kind of what Aquinas says. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. That you know, there were earlier stages of theology that believed that reason was a crime. Logic was dangerous. It could lead you into conflict. Only faith could be trusted. So with Aquinas and Anselm and others kind of creating this formulation, they're creating a world that seems to be safe for reason. As long as you reason within the frame, you can reason. Now, it has given them an opportunity that they missed. When he says, you know, merely rational proofs are always, however, to be tested by Scripture, he's basically saying logic is not sufficient. Reason is not sufficient. Intellectualism is not sufficient. And that's interesting because as we get deeper into the medieval framework, they're going to come to deify reason as being almost the family scent of God. They're going to focus more on the logos, the ego, the planning that God did, the way that he knew what to do. They're going to say everything makes sense, even if it doesn't make sense to us. And that's going to bring them into contradiction with the solution that Aquinas and Anselm have given them, which is that reason isn't always right. Sometimes reason is wrong, right? Sometimes faith and Scripture have to supersede reason, say Anselm and Aquinas. But the more the educational movement in the mid to late medieval epoch raises the stakes on how valuable reason is, the more they're undercutting the foundations of the defense that Anselm and Aquinas have given. It's setting themselves up for trouble. With Pico, you get somebody who is thinking that he can reason his way to all the solutions that God has available to us. And in so doing, like you say, Phil, he's kind of bucking Anselm and he's kind of bucking Aquinas. In fact, he initially got in trouble for the theses in his 900 Theses that questioned Aquinas. And yet, ironically, the church itself has set the grounds for that with their constant pushing of God as the ultimate reasonable person, as having the best reason, the best logic. And therefore, who wouldn't want to try to, you know, do better at logic and reason? What I'm trying to emphasize here, but I haven't quite got to the punchline, is, you know, this was the logical flaw of late Apollonian classicism, that they thought you could reason your way about the universe, and they lacked an empirical basis, right? So they plausibly, persuasively, reasonably logicked out a whole bunch of propositions about the universe, most of which were false, some of which were true, right? Like the idea of the atom. There it is, look, right there in Democritus. And yet side by side with it from all these other writers are other things equally well reasoned out that are false. And it's not until the Arabs begin imposing all of their, you know, epistemological testing that they discover that reason is not sufficient. They prove that reason is not sufficient. And ultimately, although it takes them a long time to fully accept it because they're a medieval culture too, to prove that reason is dangerous. It has an addictive quality where you can come to believe in, you know, to put it bluntly, you can come to believe your own bullshit because it sounds so good. It's so persuasive. It's all logical. It's all valid. It's coherent. It makes sense. It's all organized. The fact that it's false seems like a betrayal. It's like, how can it be false if it looks so good on paper? Let me show you my proofs, right? I mean, there's this horrible noesis, that the faculty in us that reasons through abstraction and logic and systematic thinking cannot stand that it is not sufficient. We are hardwired as animals. We've evolutionarily been put into a trap where we really want to use our noesis. It works so well for so many things. Look, we can put people on the moon. We can build atom bombs. We can do all these amazing things. And yet somehow we keep doing concentration camps and gulags and other things. The idea that we can't reason our way to a solution without the input from that despised faculty that we grow out of, that immersive, pathetic, experiential, emotional, gnosic side of life, is just deeply distasteful to noesis. And so what you see in the medieval epoch, when you compare and contrast the Christian world to the Islamic world, is you see the Christians trying to hang on to reason alone. Faith plus reason, they believe, will be enough. Faith will supply the premises and the conclusions, and reason will help us understand the relationship between the two. And they think that will be sufficient. But they keep learning new things that don't fit in that framework and can't be reconciled with it. And they cannot make sense of that because they have excluded empiricism. Whereas in the Arab world, because of the fracturing at the top level into different caliphates, the way that the different houses of wisdom have worked has resulted in the possibility not of a single monolithic orthodoxy, but of competing orthodoxies. And because they need to beat each other, they can innovate. And among the innovations comes the ability to question the logic and reason of the classical writers, and ultimately reason itself, the discovery of empiricism, that is gnosis, as a countervailing principle over and against noesis. There's a reason why it happened in the Islamic world and not in the Christian world during the medieval era. And the great crisis that's sweeping over Christian Europe at that point in the 1400s, when Pico is writing, is that we have now imported a lot of these writings. We've imported ancient writings, but we've also imported Islamic commentaries upon the ancient writings. And empiricism and reason, all of that 1,000 years of pent-up, suppressed resolution of the conflict between them is now coming to the front. It can't be suppressed anymore. And the first place it's going to show up with people like Pico is with reason and faith being in conflict. But very quickly, you're going to get this wave of scientists where it's going to be empiricism and reason and faith that are in conflict, that can't be reconciled with each other unless you let empiricism be an equal partner and allow it to criticize reason, but more dangerously, the thing that a medieval can't do, allow it to criticize the orthodoxy. That's where the collapse comes in. Phil and then Douglas. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, it's interesting. You say that reason is, well, I characterize it as a character witness, but the mediation that actually helps support faith in that sense. It immediately occurred to me like William Blake's painting, which is quite a bit later, of Newton, right? Newton is like with the compass tracing the planetary movements.
Yes.
So that's a later manifestation. But he is actually retracing God's creation of the world. Newton didn't create it. He just sort of retracing it to make it intellectually understanding.
Yes.
So in some sense, you could say Newton in that painting was a kind of demigod. He wasn't God. He was a kind of a demigod who actually almost acted as a Greek god that translated nature into this thing. So that's a late manifestation, but you could almost begin to also see that as partially worshiping the demigod as well, right? Because because God is only implied. It was
Right.
Newton that was retracing it. So that's it. I mean, so that's a kind of interesting late nexus that's actually connected to that, because deism in a sense was a kind of leftover of that relationship. So that's very interesting, and we still
Yes.
think of Newton as kind of a demigod, even though it's displaced by Einstein now.
Sure,
But nonetheless, so that's kind of interesting.
Well, it is, and there are very close relationships between Newton and Pico, and examples of that are that Newton also believed in alchemy and astrology.
Yeah,
I mean,
Yeah, but
he
it's
didn't just
liquid, though.
believe in them the way that a modern takes it up like a hobby.
Yeah,
He thought that's how the cosmos worked, right? And Pico thought the same thing. Pico thought the Kabbalah really was giving us secret insight into God's plan. And so was astrology. And so was all of these sources of wisdom, which they referred to. He uses terminology, Chaldean, he says, Chaldean wisdom, Hebrew wisdom, Egyptian wisdom, all these ancient sources of wisdom he sees as, I can't say alternative testaments, but let's say he thinks that they might have special insight into God and that you need them to complete your understanding of God.
The
right?
mysticism.
Mysticism goes hand in hand with eclectic academicism. When you start to discover that other people have thought things more brilliant than anybody alive today, it can do one of two things to you. You can either get very insecure and go about burning books, or you can get very curious and start to say, wow, there's all this wisdom out there. I have to find it all. You become like a Pokemon collector. I need to find all of the wisdom, because you don't want to be a fool, right? Your whole upbringing is that you want to be educated and brilliant and you want to learn, and all of that is going to be a glory to God. And if you fall on your face with some abject foolishness, then in a sense you're insulting God. You're like, you're an embarrassment. And he doesn't want to be an embarrassment. He wants to be a good medieval Christian. So being a good medieval Christian, the next thing you know, he's reading Muslim writers and Jewish writers and Zoroastrian writers and trying to fit it all together into this grand picture, in the same way that Newton would later be doing. Even the guy who made the most clockwork mechanistic description of the cosmos, the one that alarmed Kant to the point that Kant would write his incredibly difficult rationalist philosophy in an attempt to save the world from a clockwork universe. Even clockwork Newton still had the medieval worldview in his head, in the sense of trying to fit together all the sources of wisdom into one coherent picture. Even he wasn't willing to accept what we might on the one hand say is a profound incompatibility and incoherency if you try to put incompatible things together. But on the other hand, we might say is a paradoxical nature of the cosmos such that it looks different depending on how you look at it. And yet the different perspectives can both be equally true, just about different things. Each of them will get some parts right and some parts wrong, but they'll get different parts right and different parts wrong. This idea that human reason is not, with its finitude, is not well suited to representing an infinite cosmos is an anti-medieval idea. And so you find people like Newton and Pico still steeped in this medieval conception that there must be some way. My metaphor for this is trying to put the globe on a flat map.
Yeah.
There is no way to do it without introducing distortion. You can try to minimize the distortion, or what more typically happens, you can increase distortion in some areas in order to reduce it in other areas. But you can't get it all accurate, because in the flat shape that properly represents a globe is in fact the flat shape on the outer surface of a sphere and not a flat piece of paper. It just can't be done. They're incompatible with each other, but that's not conceivable to Newton or to Pico or to anybody else who carries forward this medieval idea. They know they can make it fit if they just hammer it the right way. And the reason they know that is If that weren't true, then how are they supposed to make everything fit within faith and scripture? If you can't make everything fit, you go to hell. They have to make it fit. It has to fit. They're incapable of concluding it cannot fit. And so the modern appetite for grand systems and grand designs, that we can make a great clockwork of laws and treaties and economies and contracts, and that it will all result in the best world that we can make, is ultimately a medieval carryover, just shorn of all sacredness. Now it serves human will instead of God's will, but it's the same idea of a grand master plan that will account for all things. This is one of the many ways in which each new epoch carries over aspects of the old epoch, but recast into a new system of meaning, so that in some ways it seems like the opposite of the old epoch, and in other ways it seems like the fulfillment of it. Again, the bud, the blossom, and the fruit of Hegel, right? We're seeing the dialectics at work. Douglas, then Sharon, then Phil. Go ahead, Douglas. Oh, you're still on mute.
I would look at, did I get it back? Okay. I would look at the situation so that it depended where you were, okay? You can be in one place and then you can be in a different place, and they had different religions going on at the same time. This was interesting, okay? They called it Christianity in one place, but they have a whole different tradition. Then you go to a different place in the medieval days, and that was a whole different one. And so, it circulated around, but it was all kind of different,
That's right.
Type of thing, so it's kind of interesting.
It is.
How that was too.
It is. I'm glad you focused on that, because it really goes to the heart of what made the medieval epoch work. If they had the internet, they would have collapsed immediately. If they could all compare their theologies to each other and discover that they weren't one unified religion, but 17, 20, 37 different religions that all thought they were the same religion, they would have immediately turned on each other, because they believed there was supposed to be a single orthodoxy, and each of them thought they had the orthodoxy. It was the lack.
One thing, I want to call it another thing. They call it all Christianity, but it was different. You go one place to the next place. You're going to wait. What is this? Going to go here and then the next.
Exactly. Like the Orthodox structure suspected that there was heresy all over the place, but they lacked the ability to, methodically work their way through what everybody believed and find out whether there was heresy everywhere. And it's why it has this quality, why the totalitarian impulse of the medieval era has this stop and go lurching quality that leaves an enormous amount of room for freedom. And as long as they never find out what you're thinking, you can think the wildest ideas and still think you're a Christian, and it's fine. And maybe you are a Christian. A lot of what we call Christianity today would have been heresy in the medieval era, for example, right? So
Yes.
there was an intolerance of argument and diversity combined with an inability to identify diversity, and that allowed there to be diversity, right? This is part of what distinguishes the medieval epoch from the modern epoch. We're way too good at figuring out what other people think, and it forces us into confrontations, or more importantly, it gives dictators a kind of power they never had before. There are times when we describe that urge to be a dictator as a holdover from the past. And in some ways it is. But we really have to understand the extent to which Stalin and Mao and Hitler and Mussolini and others are precisely modern, because no medieval ruler could ever dream of having that much certainty about who was thinking what and that much ability to root them out. That's strictly a modern thing. And it's why all the witch hunts and the Inquisition start in the modern era. They start as a reaction against the university movements and against the collapse of the orthodoxy. Because as the printing press gets created, as we get more and more industrial tools, including tools for torture, we get a greater ability to ferret out heresies. At exactly the time when the church is falling apart, it's getting the strongest in terms of what it's imposing. They go hand in hand. It is hard emotionally to fully accept the lesson. As much as we want it to be true, we're also afraid it's not true, but to accept the lesson that the better a job oppressors do of meting out oppression, the more they undermine themselves. The better they are at it, the faster they come apart, because they create opposition so much faster than the incompetent medieval authorities ever could. Right?
Yes.
Because people can postpone revolution. They can postpone opposition. They can postpone dealing with a problem if that problem doesn't even know you exist and can't find you. But if it knows exactly where you are and it comes and stamps its boot on your neck, boy, that polarizes things. That drives you right down to the root issues faster than anything. So it's part of why the modern epoch has been hopping. It's, as we get better and better at communicating.
You kind of still have it today, because you go to the Pope and he's talking one thing in the Catholic, and then you go to the other Christians and they're going to talk a different way. Then you go to, you know, all got something different, you know, completely from what they're trying. You know, I can't. It's too confusing if you go to too many of them.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, Christianity, modern Christianity, isn't pretending to be an orthodoxy. They still talk about themselves like they're an orthodoxy sometimes, but you can, for example, see a widespread medieval heresy has caught on and become, I don't know if it's the norm, but let's just say it's widespread, which is ecumenicalism, which is the idea that, yeah, we are going to search for God in a lot of different ways. And rather than trying to exterminate each other, we're going to embrace each other and say, yay, on our separate journeys, we could learn from each other. But this was unthinkable in the medieval era. And so there's sort of this flowering of diversity that's happened under the modern order. Now, it's not that there wasn't that diversity in the medieval era.
Each one thinks they're right. So that's the interesting thing. They'll fight over the, you know, there was a lot of fights in those days too with medieval and so on, because of the religion, the hostility, and the whole 9 yards, as you know. There was a lot of, you know, over who should be right and who should be wrong. There was a lot of those things as well.
Sure. And a lot of it happened at the end of the medieval era. But the point is that ecumenicalism is widespread now and accepted as being widespread and accepted as being legitimately Christian, at least by, you know, a majority of Christians. Whereas in the medieval era, even though there were ecumenical movements, they had to keep quiet about it. They had to not be seen by the orthodoxy. So that's a massive change. It's one of the ways in which, you know, I grew up among atheists, so I'm well placed to describe mainstream atheist beliefs. But one of the frequent things that you'll see in atheists is that they'll often describe modern Christians as though they're medieval Christians, and it just hopelessly underestimates the amount of transformation that the modern epoch has had upon the religion. Christianity has changed dramatically since the Reformation. Just in countless diverse ways, so that it's become nearly impossible to say what Christianity is in a sentence or a paragraph or even a book. Christianity is many different things, which, as Douglas says, don't agree with each other about what they are. And part of being a modern religion is that that's okay, in a way that it never was in the medieval era. Sharon Van Filden Jean, go ahead, Sharon.
Well, a couple of interesting things. I want to go back to where you talked about the relationship between faith and reason.
Yeah.
And that's always been a problematic one, because if you look at the definition of faith in the Bible, it has nothing to do with reason. It comes from Hebrews. It says being certain of what you hope for, yes, and sure of what you do not see.
Yes.
None of that stands the test of reason. And in the modern world, when you try to reason the immensity, the miracles, the parables of religion, I find I come up with people who are either agnostic or downright atheist.
Yes.
Because you cannot reason your way into it. Because there's no such thing. It's a belief. So it's very interesting for me to see them struggling with reason as a subsect of faith, or it's the other way around. And I think where we are in the modern time, at least the way as I see it, and Christianity is a personal thing, is that we have a God who's expressed by many names and worship in many different traditions.
Right.
And I think that so the evolution from the medieval time to where we are as moderns, right? There's no orthodoxy. It's a kind of a loose practice.
Yes.
Now, when I was looking at Pico, and I was looking at all the people who influenced them, Avicenna, Averroes, Maimonides, these were people who were before his time. So in trying to create that kind of syncretism, I noticed maybe I'm wrong about that, and I wondered if it adopted a lot of old ideas.
Yes, exactly. He was sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously adopting a lot of old ideas. And he was adopting them because, there's several reasons why he was adopting them. One of them is because he went through the University of Paris. You couldn't go through it at that era and not be exposed to a lot of ideas. And when you were exposed to those ideas, you faced a crisis. And the crisis was the quality of the thinking and writing on display among ancient philosophers and scientists and among Islamic philosophers and scientists was so much better than the quality of the thinking on display among contemporary theologians in his own life. And he had to reconcile that problem, right? Because the contemporary theologians, he knew as a medieval, he knew they spoke for God. So how do you reconcile that they're speaking for God, but they're not doing it very well? You can't question them, and yet you can't avoid questioning them because you see these other examples, and it forces the questions upon you. So his solution was that there's nothing wrong with the theology per se. It's just that we all need to use more logic and more education to help ourselves understand the theology. And he was going to demonstrate that by showing the ways that he could fix problems with the theology and say, see, the theology actually works. We were just missing this piece that, our own people didn't have enough education to tell us about. But, I have, and so I can supply the patches. With 900 theses, I will supply 900 little patches on the medieval worldview, and the result will be a more all-encompassing medieval worldview that's able to accommodate the ancient writers, the medieval Islamic writers, and the discoveries of science without fracturing.
Yes.
Without being full of contradictions, and therefore it will live on. He sort of knows and doesn't know at the same time that he's doing that. And, if Pico had succeeded, if he had been able to apply this patchwork and everybody had bought it, then in the next 100 years, there might not have been the modernist revolutions. It was the refusal to change, to adapt to the new information that created the crisis. And I want to express that in a just for a moment in a materialistic instead of idealistic way. The totalitarian goals of the medieval orthodoxy, that there is only one correct religion, that we have the only correct formulation of it, and that it must be imposed on everybody because anybody who doesn't get exposed to this is going to hell. So we literally have to eradicate every other religion from the face of the earth, or else we're criminals of a cosmic scale. Right? There was this drive for totalitarianism. The problem is that sets you at war amongst yourselves and with everybody else. And in war, faith alone is not enough. In war, your techniques and technologies matter. The side that has the better discipline, the better technology, the side that can, hurl fireballs through the air, the side that can take down castle walls, that side's going to win. It's going to beat the side that doesn't have those things. And so there was a movement that had been, nascent in the first half of the Dark Ages that really became explosive starting around the Inquisition, of pursuing science and technology with the goal of improving Christian warfare. The goal was to make, soldiers for Christ who could spread the Orthodox faith by the cross or by the sword or by both. And in order to do that, they had to beat opposing armies. They couldn't just go out there full of faith and get clobbered, as had happened to them numerous times early on, to their humiliation. They said, we have to up our game. So the moment they said that, they let reason in the door and they let empiricism in the door. Mm-hmm. And they said, we will only let you in the door in order to serve faith, to make faith strong enough so that we can militarily go out and impose this religion. But it turns out that once you let them in the door, you start asking yourself questions you didn't ask before. And those questions become problems because they start to unravel the house of cards of the medieval orthodoxy, which is the one thing that they couldn't allow you to unravel. Unraveling the house of cards that was the medieval orthodoxy made you, instead of being a friend of the totalitarian authorities, it made you an enemy of the totalitarian authorities. So by the mere process of trying to up the totalitarian game, the totalitarian agenda split itself into factions and self-destruction. There was no way for this to end well without giving up the idea that there's only one right way to know God and we're the only ones who know it, and we have to compel everybody else to follow us. That recipe inherently led to its own destruction. It had to. It would either lose battles by not embracing science and reason, or it would win battles but then fight amongst themselves and tear apart their own orthodoxy by embracing reason and empiricism. Those were the only choices available. So that's what it did. It's not an accident. That whole course of 1,000 years, it's not an accident. And these aren't just arbitrary features of the medieval worldview. A few months ago, we talked about, well, how can we say that these are discrete periods, discrete epochs? When you can find all these boundary cases, it takes a long time in between. You can find survivals of medievalism in the modern world. You can find predecessors of modern worldview in the medieval world and even the ancient world. How are we qualified to say that these are discrete epochs? And it's because of Hegelian dialectics. Mm-hmm. Because you can see that the very strength of the epoch, that its promise, that it used to justify overthrowing the old epoch, is the same thing that is its undoing. The more it perfects itself, the more it undoes itself through stages of transformations. And there's no way out of that trap except to become somebody different, which is what Hegel says happens. The bud resolves its contradictions by becoming the blossom. The blossom resolves its contradictions by becoming the fruit. It does that because that's the only path forward to it, to resolve the problems that were core to its identity, that were what made it what it was to begin with. So all this stuff, all the Hegelian stuff sounds esoteric until you start to look at examples from real life, from history, from everywhere. You start to see how it's necessary, the way that things develop. Otherwise, they wouldn't develop that way. They'd develop some other way. Phil, and then we'll go to the text. I want to talk about Savonarola.
Yes.
I guess in a sense, I want to go back to the Newton and the development of science.
Yeah.
Because faith in a way transforms itself, and it dies very slowly, or transforms into something else. A great achievement of Newton, well, many achievements, but probably the greatest is his understanding of gravity, right? And
yes.
then the motion of the planets and so forth. And Newton himself said he had his doubts about gravity, even though the equations seems to work.
Yes.
Right. So right there, it seems like there's two things that's happening. He no longer really actually believes in reason itself. He believes in computation as a replacement for that, right? And so in some sense, I don't know whether he still believes in God or whatever, but nonetheless, a faith in reason itself. But in some sense, computation becomes, in a sense, the underpinning for reason in a funny way. And then we move to Einstein, who transformed Newton and shows us that space itself is curved and flexible, right?
Which Newton would have hated.
Yeah,
He would have
which
hated
Newton
that so much.
that would have hated, but nonetheless, very interesting how time and space is transformed by
They're
mass
stretchy.
itself.
They're stretchy.
Okay, and so in a funny way, like and then when he confronted the quantum physicists, in order to create a unified system, he had to throw in the cosmological constant, right?
Yes.
Because he just says that God does not. Of course, I think he might have been using the word God as a metaphor rather than he believed in God. Although he's Jewish, so maybe he was referring to a different God. God does not play dice with the universe. So he still believes that there was something that's holding it together beyond just like these particles appearing and disappearing or whatever, right?
Yes.
Because that seems like a dice game to him, right?
Yes.
This weekend I was watching a video on inflation. I'm not talking about inflation in terms of money markets.
The cosmos.
Cosmo inflation, right? And what was interesting, and the reason this popped up to me was, the flat earthers. Now we know the earth isn't flat, except when you experience it in a local way, it does look very flat.
It does.
But the thing about inflation that was interesting is, like, I guess a millisecond after the Big Bang, there was the bigger bang, the real bang that caused inflation to happen. In fact, the universe, presumably, according to the latest theories, is that it inflated faster than the speed of light. So now we know that the universe is, I think, something like 13.8 billion years, maybe 14.8, but that very big. But if you count for inflation, there's part of the universe that's way, way larger than that. And the cosmic background radiation, in fact, is only exposing the horizons of what we could see. That is our universe. And the horizons of what we could see. And the guy is saying it's very interesting that the distribution of the background radiation shows, in a sense, quite a uniform and flat surface. And the way that inflation explains it, in some sense, it's a skirts that issue by the curvature of space, how it unifies with it, is if the universe is, in fact, through inflation, much larger than we think, let's say 100 times larger, then we are experiencing a curved world, but in a localized area, it looks very flat. And so therefore, it's amazingly flat because our horizon only extends to the edge of what we can see.
The same problem at a larger scale.
Exactly.
Earthers have.
So that's kind of interesting. It's like, oh, okay, maybe the world is not flat, but the universe is flat as far as the horizon is. It's like, it was kind of mind-boggling for me to like comprehend. Okay, so the inflation means that the universe is a hell of a lot larger. There's a lot of the universe that we just do not know. It's really dark. I mean, because it's way beyond the horizon.
Yeah. But let's bring it back to Pico step by step.
Okay.
So here's how we're going to do that. First of all, if you haven't read anything Einstein wrote about his own beliefs on God, you should. They're really interesting. He's like the intersection between an ancient Jewish religion and the most modern of the modern of scientists, right? It's like, how does he see God? And how does his conception of God change over the course of his life? It's interesting. He's an interesting. First of all, he's a decent writer. If you've never read his book on relativity, it's surprisingly readable. He knows how to write to people who don't know what he's talking about in order to help them understand what he's talking about. And his book on relativity is short. His autobiography is also very interesting. So the second thing is his position about God not playing dice with the universe. He later decided that he had been wrong, and that God does play dice with the universe. He ended up he started out being opposed to the use of statistics in quantum analysis and ended up concluding that, in fact, it's the only tool that we have to understand things at that scale and speed. And so that he had been wrong. And that's a very modern thing to do, by the way, right? That's a very science-centric. So that the ideal of science is that a scientist, when confronted with new evidence, will change his mind. And as Thomas Kuhn warns us in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, it rarely happens. Especially, it rarely happens to scientists who have been successful. The more papers they've published, the more they're esteemed in their career, the less likely they are to change their mind about anything fundamental, because for the very human reason that now they have all this investment in their whole position. It's like they can't, the human desire, to somehow rescue that investment, the sunk cost fallacy overwhelms even the people in the world most committed to overturning their beliefs in the face of new evidence, which is why it's always really interesting when somebody like Einstein, far enough in his career to have a lot of respect and to have a major body of published work and to have come out strongly against something, to then turn around and do a complete 180 and say, you know what, I was 100% wrong. So kudos.
No, but wait a minute, I need to contradict you. It seems to me the contemporary scientists actually now believe that he was actually right, that they are using they are finding the way to marry the large scale, cosmological constant and integrating it with
yeah, but the way that they're
theory.
fixing it is by applying the different theories in different parts of reality, right? It's part of what made Hawking so interesting, that he chooses black holes, where he says he can study relativity and quantum physics at the exact same time, right on the boundary, with his whole thing about black holes evaporating over time because of quantum physics. I mean, the people have been struggling with this for a while, but the point is, in the modern world, we are comfortable erecting new models one after another. I mean, maybe not comfortable. Kuhn says we're not as comfortable as we think we are, but we do erect new models one after another to replace themselves or to augment themselves, because we have this core idea that we don't know how the universe works in science. Science says the starting proposition is ignorance, and that therefore all of our propositions will be nothing more than models, and that we know a priori that they're flawed. The reason we accept them is because we haven't yet found the new data that will show their flaws. But when we do, then we'll replace these models with refined models to account for the flaws. And that idea is totally counter-medieval, first of all. In the medieval world, the idea is that scripture gave us a correct understanding of the cosmos, and replacing it would be to defy God and be like the devil, and therefore you go to hell. So it created a real problem for the medieval epoch when they needed to add more science and technology in order to become better at warfare, in order to carry out their goals. You see, they had this contradiction built right in. In the modern epoch, which we're going to talk about in later weeks after we get through Pico, we have a different contradiction, which is, on the one hand, we accept the scientific method in its place. But on the other hand, we don't want to turn it loose on all the things that question the structures of power of the modern order. We don't really want to engage in any political science. Each country knows how it wants to govern itself, and it doesn't want people running little experiments to the opposite and then publishing papers saying, you know what, this paper shows that our constitution isn't actually a good one, let's throw it out and rewrite it. The number of times that modern countries rewrite their constitution in the face of new evidence, as opposed to just sort of patching it a little bit here and there like Pico was trying to do, right? It only rarely happens. It's not that it never happens, but it's just that if we were true scientists, if science was a modern phenomenon, the way that we claim it is, we would be applying it to all kinds of things that we won't let it anywhere near. Modernism and science have a little problem with each other in the modern epoch. It's part of what defines the modern epoch. In the same way that in the medieval world, faith and reason had a problem with each other, which got a whole lot worse once they imported empiricism. So if we want to understand the ways in which Pico couldn't be introspective about the rigidities in his worldview, it helps to think as a modern, can you accept the idea that science isn't a modern thing, but is actually something that modernism struggles against, that it wants it to serve modernism, and that it wants to wear science as a badge of honor, but doesn't really want to let it loose? It wants to keep it in a cage through funding. Anybody who works full-time in science will at first argue with you on this until you talk about funding, and then they're like, oh yeah, the leash. We all know about the damn leash. Who's getting paid to do science on what is the leash that the modern order uses to prevent science from doing what it could do for us. In the same way that St. Anselm put reason on a leash and said, you will serve faith. And if you ever try to stray out of faith, that's not legitimate reason. That same recipe we're seeing mirrored in the way that moderns treat science. We feel about science the way that medievals felt about reason. On the one hand, we want to be called scientific, but on the other hand, we don't want to be scientific if it means questioning the things we're not allowed to question. This is part of what the study of different epochs and their worldviews and limitations can do for us. We can start to see the parallels, and you could start to see how somebody as educated as Pico, who had read so widely and thought so fiercely about so many topics, could nevertheless completely swallow the whole orthodoxy about nine different domains of angels and how they stood against each other and where people fit, so that even his attempts to do logic and science are all constrained within this crippling frame. He literally can't see things that are right in front of his face because there's things you can't think. Not because you're supposed to, but because you're a medieval. Just like as moderns, there's things we can't think, even though we think we can think anything. He thought he could think anything. He didn't know where his limits were. He didn't know he was inside of an epoch, and that epoch had a birth and a frame, and it was going to have a death. He didn't know that any more than moderns don't know that modernism has a frame, and it had a point of birth, and it has a point of death that's coming up, and that the birth and the death are directly related to each other, that our strengths are what's going to take us out in the end because they become our weaknesses. This is all unthinkable to Pico, just like it's unthinkable to us. But as we learn to see these things about the medievals and the ancients, we will start to gain the ability to see them about ourselves. And so for the first time, in little glimpses, in little flashes, the modern world will, for the first time in our lives, start to come into focus in little places. And let me tell you, it looks really different in focus than it does when we're comfortably immersed in it. Donald and then Savonarola.
Yeah, I'm inadequate to defend Newton. He was far greater physicist and mathematician than I ever was.
He was amazing.
But I think he would have liked some of what Einstein did a great deal, because Newton saw invariant laws of physics everywhere.
Yes.
And pinned those on an absolute time and space, yes, which were just pulled out of the air.
They pulled out of Descartes' ass.
You know.
Cartesian coordinates, right?
Right. But Einstein maintains the invariant equations.
Yes.
But sacrifices absolute time and space.
Yes.
In what you'd say Lorentz transformations, which are mathematically, it's really slick.
They are.
You know, and you still get these invariant physical equations, which I think that Newton really wanted.
Yes.
Because I think he knew, well, if he didn't, certainly Kant knew that absolute space and time needed some sort of support that Newton hadn't done.
Yes.
And Leibniz came in with his monadology to provide some underpinnings for action at a distance.
Yes.
Which Newton had gravity, but no mechanism for gravity to work.
We kind of still don't.
Well, yes, but I mean, there's as Leibniz put it, you've got these two masses. How do they know if they're side by side or far apart?
Yes.
Where do they know this, what the R squared term is?
Yes.
That they're not sentient. Well, he makes them sentient. But
problem solved.
Yeah. So curvature of space to solve action at a distance for gravitational bodies, I think Newton would have thought, okay, that's pretty slick.
Yeah.
And maybe Newton, I think with a little work, Newton could have got up to date on the mathematics that he hadn't invented himself and gone right ahead. So that was...
Yeah, probably selling Newton short. You're right.
Well,
but, certainly everybody who's been taught a Newtonian framework, when they first encounter relativity, nobody reacts with joy. Everybody who has fully embraced Newtonian physics, their initial reaction to relativity is, oh, sweet Jesus, what fresh hell is this?
Well,
because the moment you start stretching time and space.
At least you are correct that some of the best writings on relativity are Einstein's own writings.
Sure.
Because he thoroughly understood the topic and was a clear writer.
Yeah.
And you don't get that with some of the science journalists where there comes a point in their writing where it turns into hand waving because they no longer know what they're talking about.
Like with quantum physics.
Oh, yeah. I don't know how many times I've heard people say, like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and they immediately want to talk about it in some moral relativism, not in some precise, measurable relationship between mass and inertia.
Yes.
Yes. So it's uncertainty, but it's precisely measured. There's nothing uncertain about the measurement.
So, for anybody who has not read Einstein's little book on relativity, do yourself a favor and get it and read it. He's a very clear writer, and he does in it the kind of thing that the medievals couldn't do. It's a very modern thing that he does, which is he explores the radical implications of his theory, even though they're uncomfortable. And key examples of that, and I don't mean that he writes this really difficult mathematical stuff. I mean, he does things like say, I'm on a bus, I'm looking in a mirror, I can see my reflection. Why can I see my reflection? If light travels at a certain speed, it makes sense that I could see it because light is so much faster than the bus is. It says, but then now let's get a faster bus. Now it's traveling half the speed of light. Can I still see my reflection? Does it look different at all? If so, why or why not? And then he says, oh, God help us. Now let's get a bus that's traveling at the speed of light.
Right.
Can I see my reflection in a mirror? These are the sorts of questions anybody would ask at a deep emotional experiential way. This is the questions we have about relativity.
This is sort of like Newton with the apple and the moon.
Yeah, with the apple and the moon.
Yeah.
I
wonder, I never thought about it. Let's do the calculations.
Yeah.
And you see for Newton, they came out the same. For Einstein,
they come out different.
Really very same. But they were sort of the thought experiment kind of thing. It's pretty good. So since you mentioned Einstein's, I think everyone ought to read Feynman's QED, quantum electrodynamics. And it's a non-mathematical treatment of quantum mechanics, not maybe the very latest thinking in quantum mechanics.
He's a good writer.
But he's a good writer, and it's very clear conceptually about what happens in there. You don't learn to solve Schrodinger's wave equation, but then they don't really do that very often anyway.
No, that's right.
So
part of the advantage of those are two good examples of sort of modern scientific writing. They're both short books. They're both very readable books. They write about things that to this day people don't explain very clearly, and they explain them very clearly by people who are experts in their field
Right.
on a very intuitive level. The thing that you'll notice that happens in them that is a distinctly scientific and not medieval thing to do is that they question a priori assumptions, which is a heresy in the medieval worldview. A priori assumptions are given to you by scripture, which means they're given to you by God, which means if you question them, you go to hell. You cannot question those scriptures. If you read at any length, which someday you should pick something medieval and read it at length, but pick an excellent medieval writer and read it at length and compare the structure of the arguments, the way they think about solving problems to the way that somebody like Einstein or Feynman thinks about solving problems. And one of the differences you'll see right away is that Einstein and Feynman are both radicals. They go to the root. If there's a problem, they want to trace the problem all the way to where it comes from, even if where it comes from is their core beliefs. And if it comes from their core beliefs, they want to change their core beliefs to be compatible with what they're seeing. That's the thing that's anti-medieval
Well,
about what they're doing.
as I think someone pointed out when I went through Thomas Kuhn, the structure of sign that you referred to earlier.
Yes.
Very few scientists actually pay any attention to the epistemology of
That's right.
science.
That's
But
right.
both Einstein and Feynman paid just a lot of attention to how do we know?
Yes.
What do we think we know? Are we really being deceived?
Yes.
And came up with simple ways really to
Yes.
demonstrate structures of reality
That's right.
and how to reason from those givens to produce their theories.
Yes.
So yes, read them. Don't go read the latest journal article in some esoteric field where there's more assumed than there is written.
Yeah.
These are both writings where people start at first principles and say, I want to show you how this really hangs together and why.
Right. I'm going to call on Sharon in a moment, but just to close the circle on this, I don't mean to say that Einstein and Feynman are more modern than medieval writers. I mean to say they're more scientific than most medieval writers. And part of the reason I make that distinction is you can find, as Donald says, plenty of other scientific writings, and as Kuhn says in his book. In fact, if you haven't read Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that is one of the books Kenneth Smith recommends most highly. He says, you don't understand science under modernism until you understand the ways in which science and modernism are at war with each other. The ways in which the way that it's usually practiced is not true to its own core principles. And one of the ways to do that is to read Kuhn or Feyerabend. Another way to do that is find erroneous but popular scientific defenses of positions that have been proven false. So an example is, one of my favorites is continental drift. It's shockingly late how late it was that science accepted continental drift. How long scientists who should have known better were still certain that continents did not move. They had that same anxiety about the firmament beneath their feet and beneath their worldview that the medieval church hierarchy had when Pico started shooting his mouth off. You can, in reading the way that geologists, highly educated, highly decorated geologists, would nevertheless struggle to disprove continental drift, to show that continents couldn't have moved, even though any toddler with a globe will look at South America and Africa and go, hey, look, they fit together. Generations of scientists learned to ignore that evidence of their own eyes. That can't possibly be true. Because if the ground were moving, I would know it. I would feel it, right? Just like if the world were round, I would see its roundness. It wouldn't look flat to me. The idea that the way things seem, that I have attached my whole life to, is not the way they are, is very difficult to shake off, even for moderns, even for modern scientists. It's a tough row to hoe. So you can imagine, without the conspicuous example of an active scientific community, how hard it was for medievals to question their core principles. In fact, it wasn't just hard, it was forbidden. They would not do it. It was wrong. They would only question the things that didn't seem like core principles. As Anselm said, the purpose of reason is to serve faith. So make sure that you're only working the details and never questioning anything fundamental. Go ahead, Sharon. Then Savonarola.
Okay, this is just a very quick thing. First of all, Donald, could you put those books in the chat, please? The ones you mentioned? Yes? Okay.
Sure, I'll do it.
Yes, and the second thing is, I want to pick up on something that you said. Moderns want to be scientific, but they don't want to believe in science. And whether or not the medievals were allowed to question their core principles. And this is pretty fundamental. There's this movie that I watched yesterday that says, "Don't Look Up," which is the way moderns don't believe in science. You're laughing, Phil. Did you see it?
No, but it sounds correct.
It had Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence, and I think it won a couple of Golden Globes awards, but it's exactly about this, the cultural approach to belief systems and questioning and how you function in your disbelief.
Right.
So that's just pretty basic, and it brings me right to today. So some of the concept that we're discussing, the behavioral concepts, I think they still exist today.
Oh yeah, yeah. These are problems we're still struggling with. Here's a link to the Thomas Kuhn book and to the Einstein book. I'll leave Donald to put the link to the QED book by Feynman. Yeah. See, I mean, you can, if you study the writings of Thomas Kuhn, if you study the writings of Feyerabend, who's another one of Kenneth Smith's favorite philosophers, Feyerabend critiques the incoherencies in modern scientific theories. And he's a philosopher. He's straight up a philosopher. And he's a philosopher of science. He's not the kind of philosopher of science most scientists like. He's the other kind. He's the devil's advocate. He's not saying that science doesn't have anything to offer. He's saying that most scientists aren't as scientific as they think they are. And that even if they were, the very structure of science creates certain kinds of blind spots. And that we need something beyond to fill in those blind spots, or else we'll just stay blind there. And so it was Feyerabend who first walked me through a quantum mechanical arithmetic process, in which partway through the theory, you stop, you go take a measurement from reality and plug the number into the theory to keep going. In other words, the theory doesn't work. It has to be fixed halfway through with new observation. Yeah, but the people who propound the theory don't want to say that because it's embarrassing. They prefer to rephrase that otherwise because it's embarrassing. It's like there's a human element to science, an irreducible emotional human element to science that affects the way that we do it. And it certainly affects the way that, the economy affects the way we do science, politics affects the way we do it. And so once you look at all these examples, it's easy to end up with an anti-scientific position, but that doesn't work either. The truer position is more difficult for a modern to take, which is that modernity is not a scientific epoch. Modernity is not a scientific epoch, but it wants to believe it is, and it wants everybody else to believe it too. In fact, it wants everyone to believe it's the only scientific epoch, that everybody in the past was primitive and superstitious, but only we're scientists, and only we see the world the way it really is. And the value of that orthodoxy is that it allows us to then, side by side with our scientific culture, we have a deeply anti-scientific culture that we use to determine how power is distributed in the world. and who we fight in wars and things like that. And what we do is we use science as a fig leaf over all those unscientific parts and say, if you question our invasion of Grenada, then you're not then you just hate science. If you question our gulags, then you're a primitive, savage, non-scientific person. Everything that we do, no matter how irrational or unscientific it was, we have the stamp and imprimatur of science upon it, which means you may not question it, even if we didn't do it for scientific reasons and no scientist in the world would agree that it was a scientific decision. It doesn't matter. We own the brand and we apply the brand to all this unscientific stuff because this is core to modernism's self-image in the way that the medievals believed they were carrying out God's work on earth. We believe that we have rationally decided the right thing to do, even when there was no reason and no empiricism involved in it. So we carry over a lot of superstitious behavior that we engage in while calling it science or reason. So part of the reason to question this in ourselves and learn to notice when the emperor is naked while claiming that, he's the paragon of objectivity is so that we can better understand how somebody like Pico could see so much and miss so much at the same time. He had the same problem we do. He could question many things, but the things he couldn't question were the fundamental ingredients of the medieval worldview, just like we can't question the fundamental ingredients of the modern worldview. They were invisible to him, just like ours are invisible to us. And not only invisible, but really inexpressible. To express the ways in which modernism does not behave in the ways that modernism claims to behave requires redefining all kinds of core terminology, like freedom, even the verb to know, the way that moderns have defined it, obscures the number of things that we don't know but just have opinions about, but that we claim as knowledge. All that I've made this point, every month, right? The challenge for existentialist philosophers is that every important term, without which we can't even talk about the important subjects of the universe, has already been predefined by our epoch in such a way as to ensure that as long as we stick with those definitions, we can't envision the world outside the frame of that epoch. Love, truth, beauty, existence, knowing, meaning, wisdom, you name it. If it's important, if it's full of philosophical juice, our definitions are suspect. Because if they weren't, the modern epoch would be too easy to dislodge. It's got to maintain a hold on all the important concepts in order to keep us all pointed in the same direction. So Pico could only question the things that the medieval worldview didn't bake into place. And so his solution is not to propose free will in the way that some later writers attributed to him. He's not saying we will now unleash free will upon the world and we will all make our own decisions. He wasn't really a modern person. It's just that he made this along the way, along with doing a lot of other things like proposing astrology and Kabbalah and other things, he also made this interesting little myth of Homo sapiens as the unfinished animal who had a duty and a right to finish himself and make himself whatever he wanted to be. And he also said that we had a duty to make ourselves in God's image so that we could be good partners to God. But as moderns, we mentally erased that part of what he said and we left it with free, we're completely free. And it became a template for the way that we imagine our free will to work. We imagine that we are born with free will, like Pico said. That we were made this way, or we evolved this way, we don't care. Doesn't matter to us. But either way, freedom is in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are inalienable. We get them for free. This is the modern myth. You don't have to work for freedom, like the ancient Greeks said. You don't have to struggle against your own biases. No, you're born free. It's easy. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Everybody gets them. Done, just like that. By fiat. By fiat means, in this sense, because we said so. Because as moderns, we worship the human will and intellect. We believe that you can do things by fiat. We believe that we can make things true just by having a vote about them. Look, everybody has voted. The sky is now pink. We all said so. Furthermore, at certain times of day, we can look out and see that it's pink during certain sunrises and sunsets, and that proves that our vote was correct. This belief that we can impose ourselves, that we are not pathetically constrained by the cosmos, that we can do anything we set our minds to, could fly through space in spaceships. Why not? This is all signs of what it means to be a modern. The inability to cast a cold, clear, clinical eye upon the limitations of our own character and our own nature. An inability to look at what is the lawful, natural architecture of our circumstances, which prevents us from proposing solutions that harmonize with that nature that would give us a chance to escape from the problem. We instead, one revolutionary after another, will lay out a proposition or a strategy, a program that they just came up with out of their head. That's a modern thing to do. Look at me, I just invented a utopia. Because as a modern, there's, I believe, nothing stopping me from doing that. I don't believe that I'm constrained by the limitations of the modern worldview. I don't believe that there are enormous aspects of reality, including about myself and other people, that I'm blind to, and that I will never see as long as I keep being sure that I'm objective. I'm a modern. I have an inalienable right to know the truth because I say I know the truth. This is a thing a medieval would never say. So the whole point of exercising this, we're going to go to Savonarola now. Sorry, Phil. We're going to talk about Savonarola. The whole point of exercising this at the length I am is to help understand why it is that Pico isn't a modern, why it is that he's doing the things he's doing and not the things that we think he's doing or the things we wish he was doing. He's working within a framework and he's trying to make the framework work just like 1,000 years of medieval writers have done before him. It's just that the medieval framework contains contradictions so radical that go all the way down to its base that merely exercising logic and reason, and especially if you start importing foreign ideas like from those Islamic scientists and empiricism, it all is going to fall apart like a house of cards. And the church hierarchy kind of knows this, and that's why they can't afford to have anybody messing around in there. But their intervention is too late. So let's talk about Savonarola. Let's talk about Savonarola. Actually, there's a number of writers. I'm going to put a couple of links here. Let's talk about, briefly, let's talk about Agnolo Ambrogini, nicknamed Poliziano. He's a classical scholar and poet in Florence. He's translating passages from Homer, from the Iliad. He's translating passages from Catullus. He's translating ancient commentators upon other ancient writers. The level of scholarship that pertained in ancient Greece and Rome is becoming visible to modern readers, modern during, Pico's time, to medieval readers at the universities. They're being exposed to this stuff. And he's a philosopher. He is giving an example of the life of the mind. And he's close to Pico.
What's his name? Marsilio Ficidio?
Angelo Poliziano, you could call him.
Angelo Poliziano. Didn't meet him.
See you next time, Lisa. Angelo Poliziano. He's totally a Renaissance guy right before the Renaissance. You look at his body of work and the things he's doing, and you'd say, you're surprised he's not writing 50 years later or 75 years later, because he's pretty much having a Renaissance kind of lifestyle. Okay, so he's a teacher. Another guy that's worth talking about, Girolamo Beniviene. Let's put a link here. Girolamo Beniviene. He's a poet. He's a pretty much a model of what's going to be, like what we think of as Renaissance poets. He's widely read. He's picking up on those classical education. He's being exposed to outside ideas, and he's writing amazing things. And he's a Neoplatonist, right? Pico della Mirandola encourages him to study Plato and the students of Plato. And he's integrating Platonic ideas into his medieval worldview. It's changing the way he sees the world. He's close to the Medicis. His writing is supported by Lucrezia de Medici. You see, you're hearing a lot of names come up. I'm trying to start to paint I'm sketching in a picture, one person at a time, of a ferment that's taking place. Beneviene is interested in the works of Dante, and he even publishes an edition of the Divine Comedy with maps, trying to help spell it out. Lucrezia de Medici's brother is Pope Leo X.
Yes.
We're talking about a very intertwined community here. And Beneviene ends up becoming a follower of Savonarola, who we're going to talk about in a moment. So does Pico della Mirandola. So there's a quick look at Beneviene. Who else should we talk about?
Julius II, I saw him.
Say that again?
Julius II.
Oh, you want to talk about Julius II?
So he preceded Leo X, right?
Yes. Yes, let's drop a couple of links in here for people who want to follow up. So there's Julius II, and here's Leo X.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
That I read? One of the things that Pico was bothered about was that Leo X was a Medici, and it was the first non-priest to become a pope.
Yes.
And one of the things that he did, even more so than Julius II, was he extracted money from the rich people for their indulgences.
Yes.
Indulgences mean their sins.
They're buying off their
confession.
sins.
That's right.
They're buying heaven.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that Pico talked about.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. And Savonarola talks about it, and Martin Luther talks about it.
Yes. To the
We are
Reformation.
right at this moment. Even though we're not taught about Pico in school, at this moment in time, all of the major fault lines that are going to lead to the Reformation and the Renaissance are right here.
Right here.
With
Yes.
this small group of people. Because Pope Leo X, who is the sister of Lucrezia de Medici, is the son of Lorenzo de Medici,
Yes.
the major godfather of, in some ways you might think of him as the godfather of the
Florence.
Renaissance.
Yeah.
And the Medicis, they want their beautiful, expensive places beautifully illustrated. So they are sponsoring artists left and right. And they're saying, that's not good enough. You should go look at these classical models and up your game. The enormous explosion in the quality of anatomy, perspective, all of these things that we associate with Renaissance art are being driven by these incredibly wealthy people who demand, this higher quality that they're getting used to, and who have the money in order to pay to have that talent developed.
They start the consumerism as we know it.
Well, it's consumerism as we don't know it anymore. It's consumerism as it used to happen, where the rich poured enormous amounts of money into the culture. Now the rich put all their money into offshore accounts so that they could dodge taxes. But once upon a time, it would be used in ways like this. You saw this sort of behavior with Frederick II, sponsoring scholars from all over the world to come to his court. And you see it later in France and elsewhere with incredibly rich nobility who were paying for the development of music and architecture and art and poetry and science, right, as well. So, thanks for sharing that, Darlene.
I could not fit Maimonides in any of this, the Jewish philosopher. I couldn't
would you like
fit
me to
him
do that
in.
for you now?
Huh?
I'll do that
Excuse
now.
me?
I'll do that now. I'll fit him in for you. Another person who Pico was close to was Elia del Medigo. Let's put a link here. And Elia del Medigo was He's often called an Averroist, a follower of Averroa, but he saw himself as a follower of Maimonides. And he was a tutor and I guess you'd think mentor of Pico della Mirandola. And he's bringing ideas from Maimonides, who I will link in now. And from Averroa, who I will link in now, directly into Pico's life. All right. So Elia is giving Pico connections into Hebrew scholarship, the long body of Hebrew literature and exploration, and also into Hebrew mysticism, including the Kabbalah.
Yes.
And he's also giving him connections to the Islamic world, not just Averroa, but Avicenna. I will link to now. The thing, it's not that I'm expecting you to study these guys in depth, although, you know, at some point in your life, you should spend at least an hour with each one. All these people, they are revolutionaries and conservatives at the same time. They're all, the things that they can question are amazing, and the questions are amazing, but at the same time, the things they can't question are amazing. The ways in which they are products of their time who are nevertheless pushing the boundaries. They're trying to reconcile difficulties. They're trying to make sense of things. And they're creating bodies of literature, which then subsequent people are reading and sharing and arguing about and reacting to. And part of the reason I'm sharing all this is that what Pico's whole purpose is that he has embraced the role of a scholar. He loved his time at University of Paris. He loved being
that, but she does feel
ideas.
like if she got a cut, she would feel the pain. Okay.
He loved being exposed to all these ideas. And because he's a medieval, he wants them all to make sense together, right? He sees them all as wise people of the past, all of whom see some aspect of God.
Mm-hmm.
They all have things to tell us about the nature of the divine and about man's role on earth. And he wants to fit them together into a beautiful puzzle. So his 900 Theses is about 400 theses about these past writers, followed by about 500 theses in which he attempts to patch them together into a mosaic. He's trying to
make... That was a chart you put up last week. That was the
yes.
table. Yeah.
Yes. That's right. I shared that last week. And I don't know if I can dig that out again because I went down some rabbit holes on the way to that. A couple of links about Pico's beliefs, which I'll share here. Here's one that goes into his beliefs about magic. Because like Newton, he believed in what we would call magic. Oh yeah, here's the site where I got that diagram from. Let me see if I can find the charts of the 900 Theses. Here we go.
Yeah.
This is the one. Let me share this. Oh, it's my laptop is spinning for a second. There we go. It's worth looking at this, at least scanning it and, you know, looking at whatever catches your eye, because after all, Pico, whether he knew it or not, ended up endangering his own life by publishing this thing. And he published this thing in order to set the stage for a grand debate that he wanted to have with all the leading intellectuals of his time. He was going to send out an invitation to everybody he knew of who was smart. And I'm using the term directly. I mean, he had a deep emotional level. This wasn't about evaluating who he thought had correct views. He wanted to pull all the smart people together and have a grand debate in which they would solve all the problems of their time. And in preparation for that, he did an enormous amount of research, and it included writing the Oration on the Dignity of Man, as we call it, and It included the 900 Theses. And all of this was going to be a setup for what he wanted to do was to create an encyclopedia of all of the great wisdom. He never got around to that. He died first. But what the reason all of this was being set in motion because he was noticing how many mistakes smart people around him were making based on things they didn't know. And at the university, he got exposed to all these things that they didn't know. And he's like, if only everybody had at their fingertips access to all this wisdom, it would be easier for a new generation of people to grow up who wouldn't make these mistakes because they'd read Maimonides, and they'd read Averroes, and they'd read Plato, and therefore they could think clearly. And that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to have a grand debate, sort out all the disagreements they could, and then write this great encyclopedia. That was his plan. Now, to us, in some ways, it sounds like a modern plan. He's pro-education. We're pro-education. Or are we? Well, we say we're pro-education. He was, doing what you might think of as ecumenicalism, right? He was talking to people from different religions and trying to bring their wisdom together. That was a surprisingly non-medieval thing to do. He was importing, even though he didn't know it, ideas that were highly influenced by empiricism and science. Well, seems to us like a modern thing to do. And we like encyclopedias. But the thing is, he was trying to do it in order to sustain the medieval world order by upping its game.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Phil, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just a question. I'm ashamed I don't know this, but were the Medici's a new kind of nobility, in the sense that the old nobility was one that owned land and had a serf system, but it seems to me there was a class of people who were wealthy through commerce, and so that they didn't have the I guess the tradition of the old nobility. Were the Medici's that, or were they part of the old nobility? Because it made a difference if they were sponsoring these new ideas. Seemed to me that would come from a new source of understanding and wealth. So could you tell me that? Because that seems like it's interesting, because it seems to me like commerce was certainly progressing at this point, so that a new class of people could come about.
Yeah. So they were a banking family and political dynasty, and they really were starting to gather prominence only in that very century. It was just really at the beginning of that century under Cosimo de' Medici that they started to rise, and it was because of all the potential for trade and for banking.
Yeah. So they were in a sense the new upper middle class, you could say, a new nobility, right? Rather than rather than the old nobility that had the little, kingdoms or whatever, that sort of thing. They were developing a new kingdom, and they were asserting power in a new way, and through the arts and through other things, learning and so forth. So that's an interesting understanding, because it seemed to me if you were part of the old nobility, you wouldn't want to buck the system too much, Right.
So, they started out with wealth from the textile, from wool industry, but it grew into banking and commerce and trade. Yeah. And in doing that, they were, in some ways, we might think of them as a precursor of the modern capitalist.
Yeah.
They were innovative go-getters.
Yeah.
And they were not satisfied with the status quo, which is why they ended up intervening not just in political matters, but even in religious matters. I mean, they produced 4 popes. Most royal families weren't busy thinking about how can we get into and contaminate the papacy to make sure that it does what we want it to do, right? You could see how a proto-capitalist approach to the papacy would see the obvious advantage, the possibilities of selling indulgences.
Yeah.
I mean, why not? Can you imagine the money to be made? Instead of railing at the rich, you tell them that they can buy their way to heaven. They could give you a lot of money. There's a lot of money to be made there, man. Why would you not do that? But you got to understand, for most people, this was unthinkable. This was just not a natural conclusion. You wouldn't look at the papacy and say, that would be really useful as a way to make a lot of money. That wasn't a medieval way to look at things. But as Heraclitus says, when you do something a lot, it molds your mind. It changes the way you see the world. And it's why you have to be careful what you spend your time doing. This family spent their time making money. And as the Greeks and the Chinese and plenty of others have observed, the more focused you are on making money, the more you start to reduce everything to abstractions. You start to think about things in a quantitative instead of a qualitative way. Qualities start to seem like a means to an end, and the end is increasing your quantity. So even though they were medievals, the Medicis were being molded by the things they did into a Banausic way of looking at the world. And therefore, within the Medici family, the more Banausic among them rose to prominence and the less Banausic fell away, because they couldn't engage noetically enough in the kinds of calculating systematic ways that the Medici family was becoming. And so it was therefore not inevitable that they would look at the papacy the way that a Banausos would look at the papacy and say, how can this benefit me? What can I do with this office? Sharon, go ahead.
Isn't the Medici brothers, the Machiavellian behavior came from the way they lived their lives, did politics. And in fact, when I was reading, I was wondering if the intersection of politics and religion, did it influence Pico's dissertations, Pico's thesis? Because he was closely aligned to Leo X. And Leo X was a pope that ascended without any priestly background.
Yes. Yes, that's right. It is affecting it. It's changing the way they see the world. It's changing the way they conceive of the world. It's worth pointing out that Machiavelli was also writing in this era. And he was also sponsored by the Medicis. Or rather, he did best during certain intervals between the Medicis, but when the Medicis were in power, he had to figure out how to get along with them. Their existence and the things they were doing helped shape his life and the things that he wrote. So we really are talking about a ferment that is packed with people you've heard of. I mean, Pico's at the middle of all this, studying under all these people, seeking favor under all these people, being inspired by different people, and there is no way to reconcile the discordant pieces that are going into his head. And he doesn't even know how discordant they are. He can't know, because medievalism has trained him not to go to the root of his orthodoxies and search out the inadequacies. It's the one thing a medieval can't do. So he's full of contradictions. And those contradictions include, on the one hand, being part of this Renaissance style ferment under the Medicis. And on the other hand, being drawn to Savonarola, who is, how do I say this? You know, the Renaissance, why is it that the Inquisitions and most of the witch burnings happen after the fall of medievalism, not during medievalism? Why isn't the Dark Age the age of witch burnings? Why is it the Age of Enlightenment that's the age of witch burnings? It's something that we have a hard time grokking, because we see ourselves as heirs to the Renaissance, and we want to distance ourselves from all the things we call superstition. We don't want the modern era to be the era of inquisitions. We don't want it to be the era of witch burnings. So we lie about our history and we shove all that back and say, well, that was due to those old people, but we didn't do that. But the truth is, just like the medieval revolution against the ancients came galloping out of the gate with 17 heresies side by side with it, and spent the whole 1,000 years with orthodoxy fighting against heresy. In the same way, the modern order simultaneously has this liberation from medieval strictures, combined with this desire to purify medieval strictures, a desire for the pure monastic life, to shake off the corruption of church orthodoxy and go back to the more purely spiritual life of a monk, right? The Reformation, Martin Luther says he's read Savonarola. His theses and Savonarola's writings are directly related to each other. Savonarola is friends with Pico. Pico's part of the part of the Medici movement. He's part of this movement that's bringing in Islamic ideas, Jewish ideas, Greek and Roman ideas. This creative, artistic, intellectual ferment is part of the same movement that includes a desire to purify and purge. Side by side, the same people are caught up in both movements. I need you to understand this contradiction, because you can't understand the birth of modernism without it. Pico's buddies with all these other guys, but he's also buddies with Savonarola. Pico's lover participates in Savonarola's bonfire of the vanities. He helps burn books and art while also being part of the movement that's producing books and art. The Medicis hate it when Savonarola starts burning art and books, right? That the idea of criticizing corruption is all well and good until Savonarola starts criticizing Leo X, who's a Medici. They don't mind. They're happy to be comfortable as part of the same community right up until he turns on them for their corruption. And as soon as he turns on not just that, but their whole culture of sponsoring art and literature and so forth. So here you've got Pico drawing off of all these traditions one night, and then the next night going out with Savonarola and burning a bunch of books. What the hell? How is that the same person? How can a person not find the contradiction too exquisite and be forced to choose one or the other? And the answer is, both of these things go to the roots of the medieval power structure and worldview. Medievals can't go to the roots and question things. They've been trained not to. If you go to the roots and question things, you get burned at the stake. So you don't question them, which means you become a walking encyclopedia of contradictions. You're simultaneously trying to do incompatible things, and you can't see that they're incompatible. So ecumenicalism and totalitarian purging are taking place at the same time inside the heads of the same people. Do you see this kind of big swirl? You see how messy this is? We've talked before about how the different epochs don't have tidy boundaries between them. They aren't wholly different from each other, even though they're clearly definable in their own terms. They are organic growths out of the previous epoch, and their roots go way back. And the consequences of an epoch that ends carry through into the new epoch very deeply, and maybe into epochs to come. So the medievalism, the totalitarian drive of the medievalism to purify, to exterminate all other cultures, is at the heart and soul of medievalism. Just alongside of the desire of medievalism not to be shamed in the face of Islam, and to bring in education and learning and a university system which causes a renaissance, which is directly antithetical to that totalitarian goal. They're side by side, not only just in different people, but even in the same people, trying to do both at the same time and not understanding why they don't both fit. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting how in a sense geopolitics affected this, because it seemed to me during the Renaissance, Italy was the center for two reasons. It was, of course, located where the Roman Empire was, so revival of the classical period was important, but also because the trade routes was through Italy, particularly Venice, in terms of reaching the Silk Roads and trading, with India and China and so forth. And Byzantium actually didn't fall until later at that time, about that time. And when the Ottoman Empire closed off the Silk Roads, which that meant a necessity to look for another route, both by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and then later on the Dutch and so forth, to sail around Africa and then finally around the world. And then the trade. So this early form of capitalism, in a sense, the early market culture happened in Italy, and then it shifted to Northern Europe, partly because the global situation had changed the structure of capital, and that it went to Northern Europe. So in some sense, I wonder what would have happened if, like, the Ottomans didn't close the Silk Road. I
Right.
mean, like things would have been very, very different. So
Right.
that was a very important period for Italy,
It was.
because it made a connection both to the Arabian culture, as well as to the trade routes, as well as to capital and so forth. So,
Yes.
so if the geopolitics didn't change, there wouldn't have been a need to find another route, in a sense, although it would have been remained less efficient,
Right.
because the trade routes were actually easier than, in a sense, going through the Silk Road, which is a very long journey. So yeah, so that's very interesting. There was this period, and then in some sense, Italy just sort of kind of fell behind in a way after that, because all the fervor was in Holland, and then later on in England and so forth, Germany. So that's very interesting that capital began there, and it
Yes.
developed this new sort of structure.
Yeah. The other connections, it's really, we're going to do it, we'll close up today by doing a deep dive on Savonarola. But just before I do, because Savonarola is so important to the Reformation, which is important to the massive transformation of Christianity that happened after the end of the medieval era. But it's important to make a couple more connections. This is the same time and place where we're talking about Christopher Columbus.
Yeah.
This is the same time and place. And you're right, part of that's being driven by the closure of the Silk Roads, by the Ottoman Empire's success. It forces Europe outward. But I had a fantastic series of classes at the end of 2020 called The Black Past that went through and retold the history of Africans and African Americans from a Black perspective instead of from a white perspective. And they said, what are the things that white people never talk about the Black past, but that all Black people know, that just because it makes us uncomfortable, so we don't want to talk about it. And one of the things they talked about is that what we think of as the Renaissance and what we think of as the slave trade, we think of, the massive industrial chattel slavery trade that Europe set up. We think of them as two different things. That if they happen to be at the same time, it must be a complete coincidence. There's no relation at all. We would, white people don't like to think that the rape and partition of Africa funded the development of modernism and shaped it. That it created an insatiable desire for a disposable workforce. And that today's debt slaves and wage slaves are descendants ideologically of the chattel slaves of the earlier era. That when we ended slavery, we didn't really end it all the way because we didn't want to give up a cheap exploitable labor force. So we had to find other ways to get people to work when we couldn't do race-based chattel slavery anymore. And one of the things that they do is they trace through connections and side-by-side comparisons that I was never taught in history class, like the incredible role of Haiti, all the way from the beginning to the end, to today. But also the timing of things. Why did Spain get into the slave trade? They got into the slave trade because Portugal was rising to prominence alongside them by having gone into the slave trade first. And they were embarrassed to be falling behind, and they rushed to catch up. Portugal got into the slave trade in East Africa. And only later did Spain then set out to do things. Once race-based slave trade became a thing, racism took on a new modern connotation it had never had before in the history of the world. The people used to do purges and genocide based on culture or language or religion or anything but race. Race was a curiosity. It's funny how many ancient writers you can read, and some you think they're white. And then later, some stray comments by somebody else, it turns out they were Black. It's like neither they nor their critics said, hey, you're Black. Nobody cared. And all over Europe, including in England, there were Black people who had been living there for thousands of years. That's just the way it had been. Alongside all the white people were Black people. There were Asian people. There were all kinds of people in Europe. But once race-based slave trade in the modern era began, race began to be associated. It took on a new meaning it never had before. It took on a modern industrial, scientific meaning. And all these European countries, a lot of them, their very first step towards wanting to chase after Portugal and Spain and get into the race-based slave trade was to round up all the people of color in their own countries and sell them into slavery. And then the money they made from that, they used to buy ships and send people out to other places to start collecting distant slaves. England did that under Elizabeth. It's documented. It's actually documented that Elizabeth rounded up all the blackamoors of England, sold them into slavery, and used the funds to help fund their own growing entry into the slave trade. But that's not the way it's taught to us. The Renaissance and the slave trade are taught as unrelated things. The reason Europe goes nuts funding art and science and architecture and music and all these things is that they had enormous amounts of money coming in that they got from ravaging first Africa and then other continents. All these things are they're part of the same ferment. But at the time Pico's writing, he doesn't know this is about to happen. He has a pre-modern mind. So when you read his 900 Theses, you're not going to find anything about race in there.
Yes.
But 100 years later, anybody else writes anything like this, and you'd be hard-pressed not to find race in there. Suddenly, we're talking about bringing enlightenment to the savages. That's not an ancient Dark Age idea. It's a modern idea. That's part of modernism. This idea, it's a new way to conceive of the relations about who's the conquered and who's the conqueror. Now it can be done on that basis, right? In a way that would have been inexplicable to the Greeks. You can read countless Greek myths without cluing in which of these people is black. And believe me, some of them are. Memnon, the great hero who fought at Troy, about whom a whole cycle of epics used to exist, was from Africa. He was black. But the Greeks don't say, yes, and his black skin, and he's a black person, and therefore he has the following characteristics. They're like, no, he's a Greek. Of course he is. All the Greeks are Greek, no matter what race they are, right? It's their language and religion that makes them Greek. Their tribal alignments around language and religion makes them who they are, not their race. The racism, this kind of racism is a new idea, and Pico doesn't have it yet, so he's not writing in those terms. They're concerned about religion, and it's religion that gets Pico into trouble. When he cozies up to Savonarola, who is attacking Leo X, who is a Medici, it's setting the stage for Pico to break apart his entire support structure. And the fractures were already there waiting to come apart. He just couldn't see them because he was a medieval, and you can't question the roots of power that deeply as a medieval without getting into trouble. So he doesn't, and he walks full face first right into it and gets himself assassinated. Sharon, go ahead.
Race as a social construct is definitely European and modern. And as a person of colonialism, one of the ways that's perpetuated is they don't teach you about your own history.
That's right.
And I had an education that was designed by the British. You never learned anything about Africa or even where you lived. And so I was watching this series on PBS by Professor Henry Louis Gates, where he did the history of Africa. And I learned that civilization was very, very, very sophisticated.
Yes.
And the slave trade that the Europeans ultimately engaged in, there were slaves among African civilizations as the tribes conquered each other. And so therefore, it was the Africans that sold other Africans into slavery, and the Europeans capitalized on it.
Yes.
When they decided to conquer Africa and dissect it, they, they injected racial tribal disparities, which even led to more discord.
Like
So
Caesar said to do this in the Gallic Wars. He said divide and conquer. And they were
That's
all
right.
scholars of Caesar. They'd all read it. Everybody, all these guys had grown up reading the Gallic Wars. So when they go to Africa, the very first thing they do is just what you said. Just what you said. You're right, Sharon. Of course you're right. But the thing is, it's very hard for moderns to hear this. We want all the bad things to belong in the past. We want history to be a great march of progress from primitive, savage, colored people to modern, educated white people. You can find in the 19th and early 20th centuries diagrams showing from the fish all the way up to, white guys. And along the way are black people.
But you know what they say about religion? They said, if you worship nature, you're primitive. If you worship your ancestors, you're savages. But if you worship a guy who turns water into wine, that's just basic common sense.
Right.
Yes. And that's a European concept.
Yes. These kinds of, this is when we talk about modernism, we're so obsessed with Star Trek and the Enlightenment and the Renaissance that we really don't want to draw these connections. But they're there. The exact same people are involved in all of these things. Machiavelli and Columbus and Savonarola and the Renaissance artists, these guys are all in the same community. These ideas are all together. They're not our desire to separate them in order to make ourselves feel better and to say the bad ones were the Dark Ages and the good ones are the modern era. That's just self-serving rewriting of history. We do that because it makes us deeply uncomfortable to look at ourselves honestly in the mirror. We're raised, especially in the United States. I don't know about other countries' educational systems, but in this country, we are so focused on propaganda in our history classes, on a great march from one triumph to the next, from the brilliant, amazing Revolutionary War that invented freedom for the first time in the world, to each subsequent war against tyranny. We want it to be just virtue after virtue after virtue, and that's it. If anything went wrong, we want it to be an error. We certainly don't want it to be that our virtues and our vices are the two sides of the exact same coin, and that at the exact same time we were doing good things, we were also doing very, very bad things. We don't want that to be true because that's not the way we were raised. We were raised in a post-medieval conception of good and evil in which it is the purpose of good to destroy evil. And therefore, if there's any evil in us, then we're on the chopping block to be destroyed. We have no tolerance for that kind of nuance about our own moral flaws. It's part of why it was such an education to be exposed to indigenous cultures where they understand that good and evil coexist in the world. And that's just the way it is. Yes, nature provides us with, fruits and vegetables. It also provides us with bacteria that make us sick. They're both there. And it's in us too, good and evil. And that we can't be responsible adults unless we can take responsibility for the evil that is in us so that we can, discipline it and train it and work around it. But being educated around the alternative idea, the medieval idea, that good has to be 100% good and has to conquer and destroy evil and send it to hell, this doesn't prepare us to be insightful about our own history and these relationships. So the point is, Columbus, genocide, slavery, warfare, conquests are not different in the way that they emerge in the Renaissance from education, enlightenment, philosophical debate, music, architecture. It's the same guys having the same conversations. Just like Jefferson could write, we're all born with inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, could keep a slave in his basement to have sex with whenever he wanted to, right? It's the same guy. In the same way, Pico is part of this ferment. And that's why when we talk about, you read the debates about Pico's assassination where they say, well, was it the secular authorities or was it the religious authorities? Well, the religious authority was the son of the secular authority, right? Pope Leo X is the son of Lorenzo de' Medici. Everything's tangled up together. Religion and politics have come together in some ways in a perfect betrayal of the medieval goal of having all secular rulership underneath God's guiding hand. But on the other hand, it is in a twisted way a complete fulfillment because the secular and religious have now united. all those Americans who desperately want to create a theocracy, who say what's wrong with America is that there's no God in schools and there's no God in DC, have forgotten the lessons of the Medicis. Let me tell you, there was a lot of God all over everywhere in the Medici family because they were appointing the popes and corrupting the process. And when you put the powerful political incentives and economic incentives, when you merge those with religion, what you get out of it is corruption, which is what the Medicis proved to us. Right?
So were the Medicis responsible or indirectly or directly for Pico's death? I can't remember.
Pico and his lover are running around with Savonarola, and Savonarola is criticizing the Medici Pope and burning works that the Medicis paid enormous amounts of money to have printed, and they've had it. They hate what Savonarola is doing.
Yes.
So in short order, Pico dies, his lover dies, Savonarola dies. They all die. Right? Yes. Because this is the most powerful family in the world. They're richer than anybody. And, you know, it doesn't matter how beautiful Pico's vision of a repaired medieval framework is. It doesn't even matter if a different pope would have said it wasn't heresy. It's a Medici pope, right? And the Medicis have had it with Savonarola.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's Pico palling around with him. They've all got to go.
So they killed him.
Of course they killed him. Now, we can't prove to this day exactly who proved him, but they did do an autopsy and they do know he and his lover were poisoned.
They were poisoned, yes.
They were poisoned to death. And the Medicis poisoned a lot of other people. So, you know, where there's smoke, there's fire, right? It's probably them.
In that vein, I just did some looking around of the Medici family portraits, and none of the portraits look attractive in what I would. And so I'm just wondering, when they looked at the portrait of themselves, I'm wondering if they're, okay, you're going to be gone.
Oh, no, they loved those portraits.
Yeah.
You got to understand, the Renaissance artists were so much better than the artists who came before. Anybody who received one of the earlier portraits would be delighted to have one of these ugly Renaissance portraits.
Yeah, well, I guess the Medici family didn't have the looks, you know, in terms as the way we see the looks.
Yeah, but they got the money.
Right. But notice that their clothes look great.
Clothes look great, but not the face.
The jewelry looks good. The clothes look good, and they actually look like people instead of cartoons.
Yeah.
They had very good reason to love these artists. They did.
I'll tell you what, they don't look like Gregory Peck or whatever. Anyway.
Gotta go, guys.
Okay, we'll see you next week. I'm gonna spend the last 16 minutes here on Savonarola, so you'll want to check the end of the recording.
I'll watch the YouTube.
You'll watch the YouTube. We'll talk about it next week.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Rick,
yeah.
I must say that I knew there were blacks in Europe, but I always thought that they were just a few. They were Moors, but now you say that there's quite a number of them. I'm actually surprised that you didn't mention that once before, but that I never heard of that. So they've been there a long time, or were they originally in Europe, like even like kind of almost prehistory or that sort of thing?
There's at least three sources. One source is the Moors.
Yeah.
Right. One source is the Romans. The Romans routinely, as part of their empire statecraft, would pick up entire populations from one side of the empire and move them to the other side of the population.
All right. So
and that's one of the ways that they broke up disputes. They say, what's that? You're fighting us because you love your homeland? Well, we're going to move all 18 villages of you over across the continent to another place. Now you're not in your homeland. Fight over. Nothing to fight about anymore. And it worked. The other thing that the Romans would do is when they wanted to suppress, say, the English, they would find people from the other side of the empire who had no allegiance to the English and bring them over to be the Roman centurions, because they would be less likely to side with, the uprising because they had no connections locally. So not only did they bring black people, they brought a lot of black people.
Yeah.
And they also brought people from Asia and the Middle East. So, we're talking about 100 AD, 200 AD, 300 AD. There are temples to African and Middle Eastern and Asian gods in England. You can still find their ruins today. The Romans paid to have them built. They paid to have them built for the enormous population of people they imported from those places who needed those deities, right? They're like, fine, I'm willing to be uprooted and sent across a continent, but at least I need my gods. And the Romans are, sure, let's build you a temple.
You mean there was an old Chinatown that I never heard of?
Right? I mean, you know, there was.
When you say Asia, though, you're not talking about Southeast Asia, the countries, are you?
They didn't get that far. They didn't get
Okay, good.
no, but the Western steppes of Asia, you know, they brought all kinds of people in. So, you know, we look at Europe at the dawn of the modern age, and not the dawn of the modern age, right after the dawn of the modern age, after they rounded up all the people of color and sold them into slavery. And we assume that the lily white complexion of Europe that resulted from that is the way Europe had always been. But not only had there been Moors there, not only had there been Africans there, white skin, not white skin period, but the white skin we all carry, the gene for white skin that we have, didn't evolve until quite late in the Caucasus and didn't move into Europe until like 2500 BC. So everybody in Europe was a person of color before 2500 BC. There weren't any white people there. So, you know, literally, of course, there were going to be some people of color in Europe still. They were there first. White people, our kind of white people were new. Other than in the Arctic Circle. Their white skin evolved independently around the Arctic Circle. But that wasn't who came stomping into Europe from Asia around 2500, 2600, 2700 BCE. So anyway, that's probably enough on that. But let's talk about Savonarola in the last 11 minutes here. Let's wrap up with Savonarola, because Savonarola was the inspiration for the entire Reformation. But in another sense, Savonarola is why Pico was assassinated. So, you know, it's worth talking about here. Did I put a link in there? Girolamo Savonarola? No, I didn't. Let's put it in there. You know, I don't buy the great man theory of history, but I do believe that there are certain people that if you've never studied them, you don't understand history. I apply that to myself mostly because I'm always playing a remedial catch-up game. I'm trying to read up on people like this. I didn't read about Savonarola in any detail until I was prepping a couple weeks ago. I knew about him in the way most people know about Savonarola, but I didn't really know him. So here's the problem. When you mix religion and politics, you get corruption in religion. And you get it because the only thing better than holding the reins of power if you're a corrupt person is holding the reins of power and claiming to do it from God.
Oh.
Right? The only thing more powerful than you is God. And if God says you have a right to take all this money, then who are other people to question you? That's how you trump the opposition. That's how you beat them, right? You up the game to a level nobody else can up it to. So if you take a family of entrepreneurial go-getters like the Medicis, of course they were going to corrupt the papacy. They had to. It was like candy from a baby. It was lying right there as the most valuable tool to a corrupt family. They had to pick it up and use it. It's like Chekhov's gun on the table. You know someone's going to pick that thing up and fire it. And the Medicis were just the people to do it. So the thing is, Savonarola, we may hate book burnings and we may hate, you know, destruction of art and culture. And I certainly do. I hope you do too. But what Savonarola was angry about was a legitimate beef. He was right. The unthinkable had happened. From a medieval perspective, this should have been impossible. If everything is organized according to God's plan, and we are trying to organize the entirety of Europe underneath an Orthodox Christian medieval perspective, and the Pope is the head of all of that, the conduit between that church hierarchy and God, the one thing that should never be able to happen ever, 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 is for the Pope to be corrupted. That's unthinkable at a level that a modern cannot imagine, because for us, nothing's unthinkable. Also, it's already happened and we can look back on history and say, yeah, whatever, get over it. But for them, the entire promise of the medieval order was that by organizing these things this way, we could, by throwing over the ancient order the classical nature-based system, the character-based system, and replacing it with a theocracy, medievalism promised this was the only way to get corruption out of politics. So here we are. And what happens? There could not be a more tragic, complete, perfect, ironic inversion of the medieval promise. I mean, this could have been written by Sophocles, the entire 1,000-year arc of the medieval epoch, culminating in Pico della Mirandola and Savonarola. You couldn't have written a more perfect story. This was the one reason for the medieval revolution. Every other justification just propped up this one central reason. This was the whole central point, and they broke it. It was betrayed. Right at the one place it couldn't be. God was supposed to prevent this from happening, and he didn't. Instead, it was happening right before their eyes. So for us, trying to understand the birth of modernism, what we have to understand is it wasn't the tidy process that moderns think it was. What it was a complete volcano of explosive rage as 1,000 years of promises came crumbling down. And the rage went in every direction. It didn't go in one direction, pointing to a grand march of history that led to the noble ourselves who are the most objective and best people of all time. No, history is not a linear progress. It's not a great march leading to us. We are not the punchline, the finish line of history. That's not how any of this works. This is an organic dialectic. And what's happening is that the contradictions in medievalism, which were there from the beginning, which were based on its very strengths, finally succeeded in culminating in the perfect apotheosis of a betrayal of those promises, which they had to do from the beginning. Anybody watching 17 heresies and one orthodoxy come racing out of the gate in 400 and saying, yay, the medieval era is here and we all believe the same one thing. And all 17 heresies says, yes, we all believe the same one thing. And they totally don't. And they totally say, we will cure the corruption that is Rome. You know, the city of man will be replaced by the city of God. If anyone who knew storytelling could have said this is how it was going to end, in farce, in the Pope being the plaything of a corrupt political family. It had to. So Savonarola, his reaction was not, wow, look at this corruption. What we need is more modernism. That wasn't a medieval thing to be able to think. Medievalism involved not breaking the frame, not questioning the framework. Instead, he had a Joan of Arc moment, right? His response was the opposite. This mixing God and politics has corrupted God. So the solution is more God. What we need to do is double down on the medieval promise. If we just try it harder than anybody ever did before, if we just purify ourselves, if we just stick to that promise, we go back to our fundamentals and get rid of everything that distracts us from the promise of God and our duty, that will be how we overthrow the corruption. Savonarola looks at all this importing of external ideas, all this importing of rationalism, and God help us, this importing of empiricism. And he says, the early church fathers who were uncomfortable with Aquinas and uncomfortable with the university system, maybe they're onto something here, right? Because now we've got a corrupt Pope. All of this has led us here. And so in order to fix this, we have to go backwards. In order to escape the problem that has been created by the system that he believes in, but that he thinks didn't create the system, he wants to go deeper back into the system that created the problem. He doesn't see the contradiction. He doesn't see how it's not an accident that you ended up with a corrupt Pope. And how even if he succeeded, even if he won, and he completely purified Europe, and now there was an orthodoxy and everybody who believed differently was exterminated, and all the other art was exterminated, everything was erased, it would still end up back here again in another few centuries. He couldn't see the organic unfolding because the medieval orthodoxy is based on an artificial rejection of nature. The medieval orthodoxy is based on the idea that gods are not part of nature. They don't express nature. They're not constrained by nature, and there's no they. There's only one perfect God. He comes before nature. He's outside of nature. He made nature as a 100% artificial creation, subject to his own will and nothing but his will. He can't see that that creates a blind spot in him and all other medievals that makes them unable to see the processes of nature, its lawfulness, its intrinsic, essential lawfulness, its inexorable laws of transformation and change, the Heraclitean flux of the river. He can't see any of that because the orthodoxy won't let him. And not just the orthodoxy, no medieval could see that in the way that it needed to be seen in order to understand how they were hoist on their own petard. So he responds to this new development, what he sees as a new development, by trying to nip it in the bud and return to the older, purer form. And Pico's position is that on the one hand, he enjoys the support of the Medicis, including the Medici Pope. He's a religious guy, and he's a part of the, what's going to become the Renaissance. But on the other hand, it's not like anybody can look at this and not see that it's corrupt. So he also supports Savonarola. He supports them both. Two trains are diverging, and he's got a foot on both of them. And he can't see that there is no way to reconcile the two, that they're going to diverge and then come right into collision, even if he could stretch his legs long enough, like Mr. From the Fantastic Four. Even if he could do that, by the time they came back together, he'd be crushed when the whole thing collided. There was an inevitable collision coming that he couldn't get away from. Savonarola, because he doesn't understand that the corruption is inevitable, that it is essential to the DNA of the medieval order, because he doesn't fully understand the medieval order that he's a part of. Certainly doesn't understand it as an organic growing thing. That means he doesn't understand the cause of the corruption. And because he doesn't understand the cause of the corruption, he's going to identify it. Well, he's not a Muslim, right? If you were a Muslim medieval, he might be tempted to try to identify it empirically. Maybe. This is a throw of a dice. Yeah, Elastic Man and Flash, right. Thank you. But he's not. He's coming from the Christian medieval tradition, which has basically no meaningful tradition of empiricism. So he doesn't think that the way you answer the question of where did the corruption come from is by empirically investigating the world and looking for the cause. That whole idea is still waiting to be born in Europe. It exists here and there as a heresy, but it hasn't really come to fruition. So no, he's going to solve it rationally, the way medievals solve all problems. Anybody who says you could solve problems fundamentally rationally without needing empiricism is a throwback to the medieval era when that was the way everybody solved everything. And so when he rationally analyzed the world and used logic to think through the propositions and come up with an explanation for the cause of corruption, he came up with these new impurities, right? The proto-Renaissance stuff must be the cause. And so he starts burning that stuff, which puts him on a collision path with the Medicis. So they kill him, just like they kill Pico. And that, in turn, infuriates all kinds of other people who agree that the corruption is bad. And they previously weren't against all this Renaissance stuff, but now there's really, the backers of the Renaissance stuff are the same people who are assassinating people who want to clean up corruption. And so the lines of the fight are not being drawn by what the real problem is, but they're being drawn by these weird allegiances. Who happens to combine contradictory things within themselves becomes the basis for a new political movement. And that's how you end up with the rise simultaneously of the Inquisitions and the witch hunts and the sort of what we think of as a dark age goal, a totalitarian goal to purify Europe of all external thinking, is happening at the same time that the church is breaking apart. The orthodoxy is breaking apart, and heresies are becoming full-blown new religions now, new versions of Christianity. And side by side with that, you've got this art movement exploding. And side by side with that, you've got this empirical movement of science exploding. And side by side with that, you've got this new economic dynamo that's being created from the rape of Africa that's going to eventually lead to the conquest of the whole world. Just like there were 17 horses, mostly heresies, running out of the gates at the beginning of the medieval era, the launch of modernism is simultaneously the launch of another 17 horses out of the gate. But now they've all spent 1,000 years being medievalized. And so the point of this is the modern epoch wants to be understood as the alternative to medievalism. That's the Dark Age, we're the Enlightenment. They are totalitarian, we're free. They suppressed knowledge, we're pro-knowledge. But when you look at the organism the way that Hegel tells us to, when you say, what is unfolding from the blossom of the medieval era? It isn't a beautiful butterfly completely separate from the flower. It's a fruit. It's the fruit of the medieval era. The way that we conceive of politics, the way that we conceive of science, the way we conceive of freedom, the way we conceive of war, all these things, each one of them is a mix of things that reject the medieval order and things that otherwise perfectly embody the medieval order. We are simultaneously medieval and not medieval at the same time, while believing that we're completely free of medievalism. And that's why you can read somebody like Pico and find in him all these traces of modernism, while at the same time what he was writing was for completely medieval purposes. He didn't
what a
understand
lecture.
himself, just like we don't understand ourselves. Go sorry, Jenny, go ahead, you said.
I said, oh, what a lecture here. Oh my goodness gracious.
Sorry. I really wanted to talk about Savonarola and show how the art comes
No.
through.
I mean, I say lecture in a very positive way. I mean, really, it's very, very enlightening information that you're giving
Thank
us.
you,
It's
Jenny.
great. Could I just ask a very quick off the side question really quickly? Columbus,
Yeah.
was his exploration, was he backed by the Medici family?
No, he was from Genoa instead of from Florence. So he had a different set of backers. And they backed him for a while, and then eventually he got the Spanish on board. And the Spanish got on board because they were frustrated from falling behind the Portuguese. And the Portuguese got ahead of them because they were raping East Africa. So there is this direct line of connections. So effectively, on the one hand, the way we teach it is that Columbus was looking for a trade route to get around the Ottoman Empire and find the Indies. That we talk about. What we don't talk about is that's not all he was looking for. He was also looking for a bunch of slaves that they could rape and pillage so that they could be just like the Portuguese. They wanted to beat the Portuguese at their game and totally oppress some people. When he decided to oppress the Taino people of Hispaniola, it wasn't a lark. It wasn't because he's a bad guy. It's not because he's a sinner. It's not because if we just demonize him, everything will be fine and the picture comes back into focus. It's because Spain needed to become a slave empire so that they could compete with Portugal, which was already becoming a slave empire. He wanted slaves, and when he found the friendly Taino people who didn't have any conception of the horrible things that he and his fellow people were thinking, they just were not ready for him at all. He pounced on them. You read the passages in Columbus's journals, and they're shocking. He says, wow, these are the kindest, sweetest, nicest people I ever met. They're going to make great slaves. Can't wait to use these people's niceness against them. That's what he's saying. And it's not because he's a bad guy. It's because everybody's thinking that at that time. That's what Europe wanted. That's what they were searching for. They wanted to continue what the Yamnaya people were thinking about in the 3500s. Wow, this having to do all the work yourself sucks. Why don't we go conquer some people and make them work for us? The whole rise of colonizer culture is just being perfected in modernism because now we're bringing science and industry to the picture. No, the history is more complicated than that. You know, modernism has its structure to it. And we'll get to that. But at this moment, what Columbus is looking for is raw materials for a slave empire, i.e. friendly people who can't fight back. Phil, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that the cultural conditions were right. Because I was surprised that Charlemagne, who had considerable power, still had to bow to the Pope, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because that was a kind of singularity and the culture was not ready for it.
Right.
But given the time at the Renaissance, so much stuff has transformed itself that the moment was ready. Maybe not even because of Medici's, it was sort of ripe and let's say the fruit became overripe and time was erupting. And so the context, the sum total of the context is what produced the possibility for the transformation.
Oh, yeah.
Rather than let's say Caesar or Charlemagne, because
It's not one
I am
great
actually
man,
quite,
no.
I am actually surprised that Charlemagne did make the move, but nonetheless, I understand what you're saying. So that's why you're saying that Hegel does at least have his thumb on something that was valid in terms of history, that is
Yeah.
not a manifestation of any singularity, but a whole context of situations.
Oh
If
yeah.
possible, yeah.
It's one of the things that, for all the important details about history and culture and human nature that Hegel gets wrong all over the place, his core insight about the dialectic, his
Yeah.
basically tuning up of Heraclitus into a systemic way of analyzing anything, it really underscores, it helps us to understand why the great man theory is just not possible. It's not possible that all history needs is a nudge to end one epoch and begin another epoch. That's just not the way things work. Epochs are organisms. They're stronger than that.
Yeah.
They have feedback loops and systems to keep themselves intact. And
Kind
the
of-
only way that the death of one epoch occurs is when everything has gone wrong in that epoch. It has reached the point where progress isn't possible anymore without breaking out of the cocoon, because the cocoon is enclosing you no matter where you turn. And this Hegelian analysis, like you say, it leads us to look at these transformations differently and come to see how, like, literally everything was in ferment right around that era. The economics, the politics, the art, the religion, the exploration. You can't find an aspect of medieval culture that wasn't being upended at the same time. It wasn't just one thing.
So Hegel was essentially constructing a kind of like another ecosystem in a way, ecosystem of culture.
Yeah.
And it's not like one dinosaur is going to end up killing everything else. It's just like the conditions that allows for the possibilities. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, any of these epochs, if it was just one thing, the epoch could absorb that and handle it. Even if it was just 2 or 3 or 4 things. But by the time it becomes everything, when all the different strands of the culture have developed, their own dynamics have transformed into the point that they're no longer compatible with the starting premises of the epoch, then that epoch has to end, because they can't change anymore without breaking it. And they're going to change whether they want to or not. Savonarola and Pico don't fully understand the consequences of what they're doing. The Medicis, if the Medicis had known that by appointing Medici popes, they were going to bring about their own downfall, they wouldn't have done it. It wouldn't have been worth it. It wouldn't have been cost effective. They were proto-Banausoi. They were trying to be calculators and do the rational thing, but they couldn't see all of the consequences and why the time was ripe. And why
they know that? Did they know that
too much corruption?
Did they know that they had to die for it to be possible?
Right? I mean, their noble sacrifice was not actually meant at all.
And they didn't have the Tiresias to guide them.
There's just, it's never the case, including for us, that within an epoch, you can understand the water in which you're swimming. We're the fishies. Water's the one thing we don't understand. It's the thing we take for granted because it makes everything possible. So it's invisible. So it's unthinkable. So when something happens to the water, we're not going to be ready for it. That's the story in each of these 3 epochs. Other questions or comments before we wrap up for today?
I mean that the power is too good to resist, right?
Well, yeah, that's what Nietzsche says.
Right.
Nietzsche says the only way to understand this, we can look at situations where, in some cases, they should have been able to see that if they just took that one more step, they were going to wreck everything. All they had to do to stay in a happy condition was to not take one more step. And yet they do it anyway. It's just too good. They're like, yeah, it might end up badly, but I could convince myself it won't. And that's easy. See, that one thing that medievalism teaches us is that our beliefs are more important than the truth. And the proof is there's nothing you can show me that I can't mentally reconfigure into proof that I'm right. That power of the mind to convince itself, which can at the one side feel exhilarating, on the other side becomes our tragic flaw. And it's why somebody who should know better and maybe even did know better had to do it anyway, because after 1,000 years of training and disregarding reality and paying attention to what your premises are, he could always tell himself, well, it might go bad, but I can think of ways to tell myself it won't, and I like those ideas better. So I'll pick those ideas, and that way I can do it. And then I take the action, everything collapses. This is that risk factor, that danger in Homo sapiens that ironically Pico is trying to explain in his oration on the dignity of man. How is it that we can choose the wrong thing when we have these powers of reason? What is it in us that makes it not only possible, but over and over and over in history, it makes it so irresistible to just take that one more step over the edge of the cliff, right when we're standing at the cliff and looking right at it. Hey, that's a cliff. Oh, but I can probably fly. I'll just take that step. Donald,
I think you're suffering from the humanist fallacy there.
Who is?
The humanist fallacy.
Yeah, which
that
one?
People are inherently good.
That's the problem. Modernism doesn't work at all if people aren't inextricably inherently good and rational. Right? The reasonable man theory, the average person, all these things that the political and economic systems are based on, if there isn't a person like that, then there's no justification for trial by jury, for the way we build laws, for the way, none of it. It all falls apart without that. It all depends upon that humanist Homo sapiens who is a rational actor, who understands the world around him and acts on his own behalf in the most enlightened way possible. If that's not true.
Trial by jury existed before humanism.
Yeah, but it's our explanation for why we do it. That's how we justify it.
I think the older idea was you set up the conditions which are favorable to civilization. People aren't inextricable machines for goodness and civilization. You set up the situation which favors that, and you might get the result. But the modern thought is that people can be put to any pressure they like.
Yes.
And they have to act in accordance with our good principles under any circumstances.
That's right.
Which is nonsense.
This
is the modern nonsense.
That's the modern nonsense. Both the ancients and the medievals would agree that is the modern nonsense. And they would both agree that the modern project of saying, let's disregard tradition and let's disregard the cultural project of trying to grow good people and just exploit things however we want and pressure people however we want. They would both agree that was a dynamite. That was a recipe for disaster. And they're right. We didn't believe it, but boy, have we created some problems. And they're almost all traceable to what you're talking about. So,
well, Metternich saw the danger in the French Revolution.
Yeah. We're gonna be digging into all this, but we're at the end of our time for today. So we'll pick this up next week. And for the first time, we get to move past Pico and into the rest of this essay.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.